Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman. And today's topic is based on his book titled Forged: Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. It's good to have you back on the show, Bart.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining me once again. So before I get to the main questions, I just want to ask, how does one tell the difference between an ancient document that is a forgery and one that is not?
Well, you know, this was a problem actually in the ancient world as well. The people knew full well that sometimes people would write documents claiming to be an author when they weren't that person. And so when I use the term forged, that's what I mean. It's specifically a claim about an author. And so I'm not talking about somebody like making up a story or fabricating an event or telling a fiction. I'm talking about somebody who writes a book claiming to be someone famous, knowing full well they're not that person. And in the ancient world, that happened a good bit. And ancient authors talk about it. And they say, you know, ancient authors will try and show you that this particular work was forged or this particular work was forged. And the criteria they used back then are pretty much the criteria we use now. You look to see whether this book actually is in the same writing style as the alleged author, whether it presupposes the correct historical situation, whether it uses vocabulary and as the author typically does, whether it has the same themes and the same views, theological or religious or political as the alleged author. And if there are discrepancies in any of these things, then you start suspecting, well, maybe the person maybe the author says that he's so-and-so, but he's not really that person. And so we do that today, only we have more sophisticated ways of analysis because we have better ways of accessing data than they did in antiquity. And so we can uncover things a little bit more easily now than they could in the ancient world.
Can you tell us about the Apostolic Constitutions, why it is a forgery, and when it was composed?
Well, it's a 4th century document. It's a book that claims to be written by the apostles, and in places in the Apostolic Constitutions, it will the author who's claiming to be, you know, the apostles of Jesus will sometimes break into the first person. I, James, say to you this. I, Bartholomew, say this. I, Peter, say that. And so it's clearly somebody who's actually claiming to be the 12 apostles. And it's a 4th century document. There's not much debate about this one because the kinds of theological investments that it has, the kind of theological issues that it's addressing, the kinds of practical liturgical issues it's addressing are all 4th century issues. It wasn't really known until the 4th century. And so it's pretty clearly somebody who wants the readers to think that it is the apostles. And there were a number of readers that believed it. They thought it probably was. This is not one of those books that there's really any debate about anymore in terms of whether the apostles wrote it. Just everybody agrees that it's a later forgery.
Are the canonical Gospels themselves forgeries?
So it's important to remember how I'm defining the term, which is that a forgery, the way I'm using it, and the way that kind of experts in ancient literary analysis use it, is that it's referring to a book that claims to be written by somebody who did not write it. And so, for example, if I wrote a novel today, which I'm not going to do, but if I did, and then I sent it to the publisher, to a publisher saying that I'm Stephen King, and they published it as a novel by Stephen King, but in fact it wasn't by Stephen King, that'd be a forgery. And so that kind of thing does happen with Gospels in the ancient world. For example, we have a Gospel of Peter that claims to be written by Peter. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are all anonymous books. And by definition, a book that's anonymous cannot be a forgery unless the author claims within the book to be a particular, like a kind of person. Like if somebody wrote the Gospel of Mark and said, oh yes, I was a follower of Jesus and this is what, but he didn't give his name, it would still be a forgery because he's claiming to be a disciple of Jesus or a follower of Jesus during his lifetime when it's clear he was not. So you don't get that, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And some people think you get it with John. Some people think that John is actually claiming to be an eyewitness, but I don't think so. So I don't think any of these four could be called a forgery. What they are anonymous books that were later attributed to people who did not write them. Now, when somebody later says, "Oh yes, this was Luke," or somebody says, "Oh, that's Matthew, the tax collector," it's not the author's fault. And so forgery has to do with what an author is claiming, not about what somebody claims about the author.
Can you expand a little more on the Gospel of John and what exactly is it claiming when it talks about these are the things testified by the witness or the beloved disciple at the end of the gospel? So
there are two passages that are of relevance. One is in chapter 19 when Jesus is crucified. There's this figure as background. There is this figure that you just mentioned called in the gospel, it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. He shows up on several occasions in the gospel, especially in the near the end. He's not named, and so he's just called by people. Just call him the beloved disciple. And there are two passages that some people have taken to indicate that the author is claiming to be this person, one of the closest disciple of Jesus. One passage is in chapter 19, verse 35, where the author says that at the foot of the cross is the beloved disciple and Mary's mother. There's people there, and he's the only disciple there. And the author in chapter 19, verse 35 says that when the soldier put the spear in the side of Jesus, and out of his wound came water and blood. The author says that the one who saw these things has told the truth, and he knows that he's told the truth. Then later in chapter 21, there's another comment about this beloved disciple. And this time the author says, the one who testifies these things has told the truth, and we know that he's telling the truth. Okay, so those are the two passages that traditionally have been used and still are used by some people today to say that the author's claiming to be the beloved disciple. And I think that's precisely wrong. In chapter 19, when he says, the one who saw these things has testified, he knows that his testimony is true, he's not talking about himself. He's talking about the guy who's testifying. And when he says in chapter 21 that this is the disciple Jesus loved, that figure, that his testimony is true, and we know that it's true, that's differentiating between what the disciples saw and said and what the author is. It's a difference between him and we. It'd be like if you Jacob, suppose I'm talking to somebody and I say, yeah, Jacob got in a car accident. We know it really happened. Well, I wouldn't be talking about myself. And so chapter 21 says this is the disciple, and we know that this testimony is true. So he's not talking about himself. So I don't think that this author is claiming to be that eyewitness.
Speaking of that, the Gospel of Luke, who's supposedly the same person that wrote the book of Acts, is claiming to have been a traveling companion of Paul. Can you tell us the problems with that claim? And does that fit? Does that sort of fit the definition of forgery, or would you say that's something different?
Right. So whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, almost everybody agrees the same person wrote the book of Acts. The Gospel of Luke gives no indication of who this person is, but the book of Acts does. In 4 passages, the author of Acts talks about Paul's journeys and includes himself among Paul's group at the time. He moves from talking about what Paul and his fellow travelers were doing to say what we were doing. And so he starts talking about we. This happens in 4 places in the book of Acts. And in those passages, one would assume that the author then is one of Paul's companions. This is what ultimately led to the identification of this person as Luke. It's a complicated thing we can talk about in a minute about whether it's right or not. But my point now is that you have these 4 passages in Acts where the author claims to be one of Paul's companions. There are reasons for doubting that he actually was one of Paul's companions. That, in my book, would make Acts a forgery, because Acts is written by somebody claiming to be someone he was not, if he wasn't one of Paul's companions. That would not make the Gospel of Luke a forgery, though, because the Gospel of Luke doesn't make any of those claims. And so if you're just talking about, is this book forged, the book of Gospel of Luke, I'd say no. The book of Acts, I'd say, well, yes, because he's claiming to be somebody he's not. He's claiming to be a follower of Paul, and I think he certainly was not a follower of Paul.
Could you expand on Luke and whether that really constitutes a forgery or not? And could you also talk a little bit about Theophilus and what his role in the situation is?
Yeah. Well, I'll begin with Theophilus. Both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are dedicated by the unknown author to somebody named Theophilus. He begins the account in Luke by saying that many people have written account of what Jesus said and did. And the author says, I followed all these things closely, and now I'm going to provide for you, O most excellent Theophilus, an accurate account of what happened, apparently with the implication that the people who preceded Luke were not as accurate as they should have been. And so he's dedicating to this somebody named Theophilus. And then in the book of Acts, the author begins by saying, in the first book that I wrote for you, Theophilus, I talked about the things that Jesus said and did. And now I'm going to, so he goes from there. And so it's the author of these 2 books is dedicating both of them to somebody named Theophilus. The name Theophilus is a fairly common word in the ancient world. It is a word that's made up of it's a compound word made up of the word God and the word loved. And so it either means beloved of God or lover of God. But we don't know, we don't know which Theophilus this might have been of the many, many people named Theophilus. The big debate among scholars is whether it's an actual person or not. Many people have thought over the years, have assumed that this in fact is an actual person, that he is a non-Christian, and that he's some kind of Roman administrator, because he's called Most Excellent Theophilus, which is a term in the book of Acts, Most Excellent, that it gets applied to a Roman administrative authority in the book of Acts. And so it's assumed that if this person, Theophilus, has the same title, it must mean that he's also a Roman administrative officer. And then the implication then is that this author, Luke, whatever you call him, was writing these 2 books in order to explain the life of Jesus and the history of early Christianity to this Roman administrator, presumably because he wanted the Roman administrator to understand the truth behind Christianity rather than the rumors that he may have heard. So that's one theory, that it's an actual person. The other theory, which I prefer, and it's a common theory, is that the name Theophilus actually is meant to be a symbolic name for lover of God or beloved of God, and that Luke, whoever's writing this, is writing this for his fellow Christians. He's writing this for people who are in the Christian community who are beloved of God and who love God. One reason for thinking that is that it is completely implausible, I think, for somebody to write these extremely large books. These are 2 of the largest books in the New Testament altogether. These 2 books take up about 1/4 of the New Testament. They take a long time to read. One of them is 24 chapters, one of them is 28 chapters, and these are long books. What's the deal with that? Well, what the deal is that this author probably is not handing these over to some Roman official. Some pagan Roman official isn't going to read these books. And so I think, surely the author knew that. I think he's writing this for his internal community. So that's who Theophilus was. So I don't think he gives us much of an indication of who the author might have been.
I'm going to take the super chat real quick from iFishnatai. Thank you for your super chat. A new theory is James, brother of Jesus, is a beloved disciple and contributed to John. Thoughts?
Well, I'd say there's absolutely no evidence of it. And in fact, there's good evidence against it. Because in the book of John, the Gospel of John, the brothers of Jesus in chapter 7 don't believe in him. And so James, the brother of Jesus, is not the beloved disciple, and in no tradition is the brother of Jesus one of the disciples. This person, the beloved disciple, is at the Last Supper. He's one of the 12. We have several lists of who the 12 are in the Gospels, and James is never one of them. In the Gospel of John, it says he didn't believe in him. And in Gospel of Mark, it implies that James, the brother of Jesus, didn't believe in him. It appears that James, the brother of Jesus, became a believer in Jesus after Jesus died, that he claimed that he saw Jesus alive afterwards. So I don't think there's any reason at all to think that, in my opinion, that James would be the beloved disciple.
I'd like to circle back to Acts. Some people think that the we sections of Acts, the we passages, reflect an earlier text that was incorporated into the larger framework of canonical Acts by the author of Acts that actually goes back to an actual traveling companion of Paul. What's your thoughts on that?
Let me say two things about that, and this might take a minute because I never did get around to answering your question. What about it? Was he a traveling companion of Paul? There are good reasons for thinking that the author of Acts, whatever you think about these four passages, that the author of Acts was not one of Paul's traveling companions. The strongest argument against that is that whenever the book of Acts talks about something that happened in the life of Paul, or talked about what Paul preached as his gospel message, whenever that happens, and it's something that Paul himself also talks about, both in the minor details and often in big issues, they differ from each other. Sometimes in tiny ways, but sometimes in major ways, such as like, what was Paul's gospel message? It depends if you read the book of Acts, where he preaches one thing, and in his own accounts, he has a completely different message, not just a different message, but like a contrary message. But there are all sorts of details when the author of Acts says that Paul went here and did this. You compare that with what Paul himself says. Paul says something contrary, like contradictory. I'll give you one example. When in the writings of Paul, when Paul has his vision of Jesus and stops persecuting the church to become a preacher of Jesus, when he has his conversion experience, he emphatically states that when that happened, he did not go to Jerusalem in order to confer with the apostles, but he went off and went off to Arabia, and he was there for 3 years. And only then, after 3 years, did he go. When you read the book of Acts, Paul converts, he has a vision of Jesus, and he goes into the city of Damascus where he was heading. And as soon as he leaves Damascus, the first place he goes, the first thing he does is he makes a beeline to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles. Paul insists, and Paul actually includes an oath. He says, I swear by God, I'm telling you the truth, that he did not go to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles. And that's exactly what it is in Acts. Well, so that kind of thing happens a lot. And so it looks like this person was not a traveling companion of Paul, but you do have these four passages where the author starts speaking in the first person. And so one venerable solution to this among scholars is the one that I used to teach for years, before I looked into it even more carefully and thought about it a bit more, which says that what these we passages are they represent, as you said, Jacob, they represent like an itinerary that one of Paul's companions kept during his journeys, that this author somehow had access to fragments of this itinerary and inserted it in 4 places in his thing, so that in 4 places you have this kind of travel log by this person who was with Paul at the time.
Can you tell us about forgeries in the name of Peter?
Yeah, I can. There are lots of them. And so in the New Testament, we have 2 books that explicitly claim to be written by Peter, Jesus' closest disciple, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. I will say that almost every critical scholar, even a lot of evangelical scholars, will agree that whoever wrote 2 Peter could not have been the author of 1 Peter. Their writing styles are so drastically different that it looks like it can't be the same author. And I can explain how that works further if you'd like. But there are other books outside of the New Testament that also claim to be written by Jesus' disciple, Peter. We have a Gospel of Peter that I mentioned earlier, one of our earliest Gospels. We don't have the entire thing. We have a portion of it, but in that portion of it, the author, who has been speaking in the first person throughout, identifies himself by saying, "I, Simon Peter." So he's claiming to be the author of this fragmentary account, was claiming to be Peter. We have several letters allegedly by Peter that claim to be by Peter outside the New Testament. A letter that he allegedly wrote to James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Church of Jerusalem, where Peter blasts another person who is teaching a lawless gospel to the Gentiles. So it's a gospel where you can be saved without the law, to the Gentiles. So that's Paul. And in this letter, allegedly Peter, calls this person the man who is my enemy. Whoa, that's good. Paul is Peter's enemy. We have 3 books that are apocalypses that claim to be by Peter. They're very different from each other. The 2 that are available in English translation are one that's in Greek, which is the first account we have of somebody being given a guided tour of heaven and hell. And Peter, the author, writes about it in the first person as Peter. And we have another account, which is in the Coptic language, the Egyptian language, which is a Gnostic account of Peter allegedly watching the crucifixion and being confused because Jesus appears in multiple forms, and the person the person being crucified is not the real Christ. It's the humanoid version of Christ, but not really Christ. And so it's a really interesting but rather confusing account. So my point is, we have lots of books that claim to be written by Peter, and I think it's pretty clear. Everybody agrees he didn't write these ones outside the New Testament. I don't think he wrote the ones inside the New Testament either.
Can you go into why the author of 1 Peter is not the author of 2 Peter?
Yeah. One way that you evaluate whether somebody wrote something is by looking at the writing style. This is what, as I said, was common in the ancient world. We have a very kind of a humorous story told by one of the most prolific authors of antiquity, Galen, who was a physician in the 2nd century and was a medical writer. But he wrote a lot of different things. He's a major figure in Rome. He was actually the personal doctor to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. And so he was very famous in his day, wrote lots of books. And he tells an account in which he was walking down a street in Rome and was passing by a bookseller shop. And there were 2 people having an argument. One of them had just bought a book by Galen. And the other one, Galen's overhearing this. He's having this argument. The one guy has bought this book, and the other guy's looking and said, Galen didn't write this. He started reading. He said, this is not at all his writing style. This is not by Galen. And so they're having this dispute. Did Galen write it or not? It turned out Galen had not written it, but he overheard this conversation. And so he went home and he wrote an account that's called On My Books, which is something could be entitled How to Recognize Books Written by Galen, because he explains which books are his and which ones are not. And in this case, it's just the writing style. You have something very similar with 1 Peter and 2 Peter. 1 Peter is written in rather elevated Greek with using a lot of rhetorical devices in Greek. It is well written and well structured, and is it's not like reading one of the top elite Greek authors in the classical world, but it's very good Greek. 2 Peter is written in a very different writing style that is unmistakably different in the way he uses language, the way he constructs his sentences and his paragraphs, the vocabulary he uses, the concerns that he has. And so it is widely recognized as not being from Peter. And that was recognized actually in the early church. Into the 4th century, there was a famous teacher of Jerome. This guy's name was Didymus. They call him he's known by as Didymus the Blind. He actually comes out and says that 2 Peter is a forgery, because he knew it couldn't have been written by Peter. So scholars today do that kind of analysis, not just with 2 Peter, but with all the books of the New Testament, where we have multiple authors of other books, and you see whether it's in the correct writing style or not. It's not that people can't change their writing style. Of course, everybody changes their writing style, and depending on the occasion and how old they are and when they're writing and why they're writing and what their concerns are. And so all that's taken into account. But even with that, it's quite clear this person is not the same author.
And what about the non-canonical epistle of Peter?
So we have a couple of them. One of them is in the group sometimes loosely called the Gnostic Gospels, a letter that Peter wrote to Philip. The more well-known one is the one I was mentioning earlier, where Peter writes to James, and he's writing to James because he allegedly Peter is allegedly writing to James, and Peter is writing to the leader of the Jerusalem church, James, and he tells him that he has to be careful. James has to be careful to whom he gives Peter's writings, because Peter's afraid, and this alleged Peter is afraid that somebody will change his wording to make him say something that he doesn't really believe. And he is especially wants to be emphatic that he is somebody who describes the importance of following the Jewish law, and that you have to follow the law if you're going to be a follower of Jesus. And that's why he attacks the man who is my enemy. He doesn't name him as Paul, but he's the apostle who takes the gospel without the law to the Gentiles. And so it's clearly talking about Paul. This book is a kind of a preliminary text in a group of another set of forgeries called the pseudo-Clementines. There are writings allegedly written by one of the early bishops of Rome, one of the first popes, who allegedly was appointed by Peter. There are these books allegedly written by him that were very popular through the Middle Ages. And one of this sets of books has this letter at the very beginning of it. And so it's usually just called the Epistula Petri, the letter of Peter. But it's a book that is clearly taking an attack on Paul, but also clearly is not something that's original.
And what about the forgeries perpetrated by Marcion?
So Marcion is a 2nd century church father who founded a form of Christianity that was very, very popular in the 2nd and 3rd centuries and continued on for centuries after that. They're usually called the Marcionites because they followed the teachings of Marcion. Marcion was living about the middle of the 2nd century. The tradition is that he went to the city of Rome and that he stayed in Rome for a number of years, right at the end of the first half of the second century. And he wanted to convince people that Paul, the Apostle Paul, was the one who truly understood what Christianity was all about. The other apostles did not understand because the other apostles, who were Jews, even though Jesus preached something contrary to Judaism, according to Marcion, his Jewish disciples never got it. And so that's why Jesus had to appear to Paul a couple years later, because the original disciples didn't understand Jesus' message, but Jesus converted Paul, and Paul did understand his message, that the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, is not the true God, that Jesus comes from a different God and has come into the world to save people from the God of the Jews. And so Marcion's gospel is that the Old Testament is not a Christian book. The Old Testament God is not a Christian God. Christ is not the son of the Old Testament God. Jesus comes from a stranger God, a God who's a stranger, a foreigner. He's not been known to the world until Jesus came into the world, and Jesus came to save people from the clutches of the wrathful God of the Old Testament, who gave people a harsh law that nobody can follow. And since people can't follow it, he sends them all to hell. Jesus came to save people from that God. So that's Marcion's his basic view of things. He had some books that he used in order to prove his point that he claimed were scripture. One thing he did is he collected books that were in circulation among Christians and said this is the canon of scripture. It was it consisted of 10 of Paul's letters and some form of the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. And he said these are the only scriptures. He allegedly doctored those books by cutting out parts that affirmed the God of the Old Testament and saying, and quotations of the Old Testament, because he didn't think that Jesus or Paul would quote the Old Testament because they were against the God of the Old Testament. The other book that Marcion created was a book called the Antitheses. An antithesis is a contrary statement. And what Marcion's book, apparently, we don't have this book anymore. We only have references to it by later church fathers who were against it. This book, Marcion would take passages from the Jewish Bible, what Christians came to call the Old Testament, and passages from the life of Jesus or from Paul to show that they stood at odds with each other in ways that could not be reconciled, as a demonstration that Jesus did not represent the Jewish God. And so, for example, according to the Old Testament, when God sent in the Israelites to take the promised land, he began by sending them to Jericho, where they were to march around the city 6 times, once a day for 6 days. Then the 7th day, march around 7 times. And on the 7th time, to shout and blow their trumpets, and the walls will come a-tumbling down. And they did it. The walls came a-tumbling down. And then they were told to go into the city and murder every man, woman, child in the city, plus every animal. Kill everything. And Marcion said, Jesus said, love your enemy. Turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you. Is this the same God? No, it's not the same God. Of course, it's not the same God. One says to slaughter your enemies, the other says to love your enemies. And so Marcion had things like that in his book, The Antitheses, to show that the God of Jesus was not the God of the Old Testament. Now, as to your question, those are the 2 books we know of from Marcion. And if our information about those books is correct, then neither one of them is a forgery, because neither one of them claims to be written by somebody who did not write them. One of them was a collection of previously written books, a canon of scripture, and the other was one that Marcion wrote in his own name. So it may be false, it may be fabricated, it may contain bad information, or it may contain good information, but it's not an author claiming to be someone other than who he is.
What are your thoughts on the third epistle of Corinthians?
Well, one thought is that most people have never heard of it. And so in the New Testament, we have two books that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Outside the New Testament, there's a book called 3rd Corinthians. It is again a letter, allegedly written to the Corinthians by Paul. The first two, the ones in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, are books that just about everyone I've ever met, including the most radical skeptic, believes that Paul actually wrote the letters. Whether they agree what's in the letters is another thing, but everybody agrees Paul wrote them. 3rd Corinthians, no. So 3rd Corinthians comes down to us as part of a larger collection that is put together called the Acts of Paul. In the New Testament, we have the Acts of the Apostles, which is about the spread of Christianity after the death of Jesus throughout the world. Peter is the main character in the first 12 chapters, and Paul's the main character in the final 2/3 of the book, up to chapter 28. And so there you have accounts of Paul's missionary activities and his preaching and miracles and such. The Acts of Paul is a late 2nd century production based on legends about Paul that also deal with his missionary journeys, and by and large tell stories not found in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. Included in this narrative account of Paul's activities are some of his writings. You have other of these apocryphal acts, by the way. We have 5 of them altogether. We've got apocryphal accounts of the legendary accounts in books of John, of Peter, of Andrew, of Thomas, and of Paul. So those are 5 apocryphal acts. And we get many of our legendary accounts that people know today about the apostles from there. They're legendary, but including, for example, that Thomas went to India, or that Peter got crucified upside down. These are things that you find in the apocryphal acts, and they're just legendary materials. Paul has these legendary materials in his, including a very interesting story of Paul baptizing a talking lion in the wilderness. A lion who talks with Paul and gets baptized, and then later, when Paul is being put to death in the arena, they let the wild animals on him, and the lion who comes out happens to be the lion that he baptized. They have a nice chat, and and they both escape. So it's that kind of legendary account. Within it is an account of the Corinthians being upset because some heretics have come among them and convinced a number of them, or tried to convince a number of them, and having some success, that Jesus was not really a human being. Claiming that this is the truth of the gospel, that the apostles would agree with this, that Jesus was a divine being, but he wasn't a human being. If he was a human being, then he couldn't be God. And he's got to be God, so he's not a human being. And so that's what these false apostles are teaching. And the Corinthians, some of the Corinthian leaders, write Paul and say, you got to help us here, because they're convincing people, and it's really leading to chaos because they don't think Jesus was a real flesh and blood human being. And so Paul writes his letter in return to them to explain that Jesus was fully human. He was born of the flesh. He was born of the Virgin Mary, but he was fully flesh, and they died in the flesh. And you have to believe in the flesh of Christ, or you can't really be a Christian. And so 3rd Corinthians, I guess technically it'd be this response of Paul, but they usually group it together with the account of the letter from the Corinthians to Paul. There's a little paragraph in between the two explaining that Paul got it and read it, and then this reply that he made. There's no way this was something that Paul actually wrote. Again, the writing style is not like Paul's, but even more importantly, this idea of a heresy sprouting up saying that Jesus was not a flesh and blood human being are well after the day of Paul. There's nothing like that in Paul's time. And so there's really no dispute about this one as well, although it did get included in some Bibles. In the Armenian Bibles, it was included as part of Scripture.
All right, I'm going to take a few super chat questions before we get to more questions on Paul. Jonathan Munch, thank you for your super chat. Lena Einhorn thinks that the Mount of Olive arrestation is modeled on the Egyptian character from Josephus. What do you think of this theory? Thanks.
I don't think it works temporally very well. I think, for one thing, Josephus's account is many years later. The account of Jesus' arrest in Gethsemane occurs already in the Gospel of Mark, and the account of the Egyptian that Josephus talks about, Josephus, so the first century Jewish historian Josephus, our principal source of information about Judaism in Israel during the first century, does talk about apocalyptic preachers other than Jesus of Nazareth. He mentioned John the Baptist, but he has these two others in particular one is named Theudas and the other is named the Egyptian. And they both are making apocalyptic proclamations at different times about how God is going to enter into judgment with Jerusalem. And that these apocalyptic preachers are gathering large followers, and in both cases, they are the Romans don't want anything to do with them, and so they attack their followers. There's nothing in the account that Josephus has of the Egyptians that is particularly close at all to Mark's account of Jesus being arrested in Gethsemane, or John's account of Jesus being arrested, or any of the. So there aren't literary links to make you think that these are connected accounts. The only thing that's comparable is that they get they raise the ire of the Romans who come out and get them, and leads to bloodshed. So you get that in those three accounts, but you get those in a lot of accounts. And so I don't think that there's any, including in Josephus. So I don't think that there's anything in particular about the Egyptian account to make you think that somehow the gospel story is modeled on it.
Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Bart, on your podcast, would you consider interviewing Nina E. Livesey for her new book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context?
Well, I do interview people on my podcast who have written books recently, and I haven't read Nina's book, so I'm not familiar with it, and I don't know really. Usually what I do is I interview people who have like a kind of a bold new thesis, or they're advancing the field in some way. I don't know her book, so I don't know what her thesis is, or and I don't know. I actually haven't read her other works, so I don't know what she's like as a scholar. So I'm open to interviewing people, absolutely, especially if they've got work that I think is newsworthy for people in the podcast audience. For people who don't know, my podcast is just called Misquoting Jesus. It's a weekly podcast, and it's mainly me being interviewed by Megan Lewis, but I do on occasion interview people who've written recent and compelling books.
By the way, Nina's book is actually it's releasing in a few days. It's about reassessing apostolic authorship, questioning if anything attributed to Paul at all in the New Testament can be considered Pauline.
Yeah, good. No, I mean it's an important issue, and I've got I have a former student named Benjamin White who teaches at Clemson. And he's a very, very fine Pauline scholar. He's going to be speaking on this issue at the conference I'm doing in September. I'm doing this conference in September called the New Insights into the New Testament, that will focus on the life and letters of Paul. And Ben White called in a book that he's writing, calls into question a lot of the criteria people use for assessing which books Paul wrote. I don't think that he takes a completely skeptical point of view. That he didn't write anything. I'll be happy to look at Nina's book, because I think it's very very difficult to demonstrate that somebody didn't write didn't write any of the books, that Paul didn't write any of the books. I could see, you can certainly show that he didn't write some of the books attributed to him, but to show he didn't write anything would take a lot of argumentation and evidence that at least I wouldn't be aware of having. But I'm happy to see what she says. There have been people who've argued this, and I'm sure she probably refers to this, but there were some very skeptical scholars, especially in the early 19th century, who maintained that Paul didn't write anything. So I'll be interested in seeing her book.
That does raise a question for me, though. How does can one actually achieve certainty about what Paul's supposed genuine writing style is?
So my view is that when it comes to the ancient world, there's almost nothing that we have certainty about. If you mean by 100% absolute certainty. Did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon? Well, almost certainly. Did whatever? I mean, pick something. Did Nero commit suicide? Well, almost certainly. Did Caligula get assassinated? Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, so there are levels of probability, and so when it comes to authorship issues, you have to take a lot of things into account. One thing is, if you've got a book that claims to be written by somebody, the natural inclination is to say innocent unless proven guilty. And so, the natural inclination is if you're reading a book that says it's by Stephen King, I mean, you just assume it was written by Stephen King, unless you got some very good reasons for thinking otherwise. And so that's true with antiquity as well. And so with Paul's books, I think, with all of the books that we've mentioned so far, I mean, you got the 13 in the New Testament, 6 of which are widely disputed among scholars. Then you've got books outside the New Testament, such as 3 Corinthians, which I just talked about, or the letter to the Laodiceans, or the correspondence with Seneca. These are things we might talk about later, but you have all these books. And so the issue is, how do you decide? So the first step is usually to figure out if there's any books that you're pretty sure he wrote and why. In the case of Paul, it's pretty clear that none of the things outside the New Testament could be a contender for a variety of reasons I can explain in detail. Within the New Testament, you've got the 13, and the question is, did he write any of those? Several points to be made. First of all, if people are writing books in the first century claiming to be Paul, a very good reason for thinking they would be doing that is because they're aware that Paul wrote letters. In other words, writing books in his name, writing letters as if by Paul makes best sense if Paul was writing letters. If they're ancient, I mean, if you've got some from the 6th century, it doesn't mean much. But I mean, within decades later, so that's one thing. Another thing, if you take Paul's letters and you just read them, you try to figure out, is there something that is kind of distinctive about any set of these letters? Like, are there characteristic phrases that you find scattered throughout them, characteristic theological claims, characteristic comments, characteristic points of view, characteristic attitudes? Are there things that tie these together, like the theology, the writing style, the vocabulary, the thinking, the assumptions, the opposition? Those things, are there things that bind any of these together or not? And the general consensus has been for a very long time, including among people who are very critical generally, and who, even people who wouldn't give a toss whether Paul wrote any of these or not. But there's a general consensus among people who just kind of look at this stuff and want to know that there are 7 letters that do seem to cohere well together. And so those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those all hold together in these various ways. There are differences among them, but nothing hugely different the way there are between, say, the book of Ephesians and these other letters, or the book of 1 Timothy and these letters. So the other thing about these 7 letters is they seem to be clearly situated in a context that would have been in place around the early decades of Christianity. The kinds of issues that are addressed are not issues that were arising much later. They were not issues that were arising much earlier. They seem to be kinds of issues in the 50s and the 60s. And so, it's not certain that Paul wrote them, but the preponderance of evidence points that way. He's famous as a writer. Maybe he was a writer. He's famous early on as a writer, not later. And you have these coherencies that fit into the time that we're pretty sure he was alive. And so we have later authors, not long afterwards, who talk about Paul as a writer. From the early 2nd century, we have, for example, Ignatius, who talks about Paul. He writes a letter to the Ephesians and talks about Paul writing a letter to them. And so you have other indications of this. And so it's, you start having people quote Paul early on, the letters of Paul early on. So on the whole, I would say that when it comes to these 7 letters, if somebody wants to say Paul didn't write anything, I think, it's perfectly welcome. We certainly have to look at that and look very carefully. I have real difficulty imagining that there's evidence that we haven't noticed before, frankly. As you probably know, Jacob, there are people, I'm 68. I've spent 50 years studying Paul, but about 40 of those seriously, and reading scholarship on Paul. And there are people who's like, they've done that full time for 50 years. And it's hard for me to imagine what evidence somebody else is finding, but we're always open to whatever evidence is out there. And I have no personal stake in this at all, because I don't believe in the New Testament or anything. So I'm happy to see the evidence, but it'd be hard for me to imagine what it could be. Do you know, Jacob? Do you know what her argument is?
Nina's argument?
Yeah.
Well, her book's not out yet, so I haven't read it yet. But what I did read, what I read about it, like in the Amazon description, for instance, it's about redating the Pauline epistles to Marcion's era or shortly after, somewhere around there. That none of the Pauline epistles in the New Testament go back to the historical Paul. It doesn't seem to be there's no specific claim that I know of so far that the historical Paul didn't write anything, but that the epistles that we have attributed to him are not his writings per se.
Okay. Well, there are other people who've pointed out the similarities of Paul and Marcion, and sometimes they do. There's a good reason for Paul and Marcion being similar, is because Marcion saw Paul as his hero, and so he tried to replicate what Paul did, but on the standard reading. Some people have used that to argue that Marcion is actually 1st century, but it sounds like he's trying to argue that in fact Paul's 2nd century. Boy, that's going to be a tough one. So well, I'll be happy. I'll be looking forward to seeing what she cites as evidence. You may know the people who listen to this may know that we have difficulty with Marcion reconstructing his teachings and his writings, because we don't have any of his writings. The way we know about him are in references to him mainly by the 2 major sources are Tertullian around the year 200, who wrote a 5-volume book against Marcion, and Epiphanius at the end of the 4th century. And there are some other sources, but it's all references to him by later authors. And so it's very, very difficult to reconstruct parts of Marcion's teachings, and especially his corpus of Paul, because it's just hard. There's some very fine scholarship on these issues by people like Dieter Roth, who teaches at Boston College, and Ulrich Schmidt, who's a German scholar, a very, very fine German scholar, and other people like that. But we're always open to new insights based on people's analyses.
Yeah, this is a book that I have by Nina, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah, she's basically.
Like that book is,
she's analyzing Galatians and looking at making comparisons sometimes with Demosthenes and similarities with some rhetoric with Cicero. discussing things like, is Paul anti-Torah or not, and other stuff like that.
But in that book, she thinks Galatians is by Paul.
Yes, if I remember correctly, yes. But it later, like, I'm actually having her on my show soon, and she, like, it formed a basis for her to later question the authenticity of Galatians, as I understand it. Yeah.
Okay.
Because initially, yes, I think she did take it to be genuine, but later, came to believe otherwise.
Okay.
And speaking of if something is genuine or not, what makes the pastoral epistles 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus obvious forgeries not composed by Paul?
Well, I wouldn't say they're obvious. For many centuries, they were accepted as being authentically Pauline from early times. Obviously, they're in our canon of Scripture. And they weren't really seriously questioned until the 19th century. But scholars started recognizing that there are problems with 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And as they started looking at these, they started noting very widespread differences from Paul himself. By the way, I guess we haven't pointed out that you've noted that I've got this book Forged, where I explain what critical scholars say about the early Christian pseudonymous writings. The writings are forgeries in other people's names. That book and it deals not just with the New Testament, but it's mainly the New Testament, that book. If anybody's hardcore, like they really want to see the serious arguments that scholars use for things like the pastoral epistles, or even 3rd Corinthians, or any of the books we're talking about, the book of Acts, I have a much larger book that's called Forgery and Counter-Forgery, which is written at a scholarly level that lays out the arguments and in considerable detail. And so if you don't want the kind of summary statement that, that gives some of the evidence but doesn't really dig deep, you really want to dig deep, that would be the place to go for these, with full bibliography of the major works going back to the earliest scholarship on this stuff. So in any event, with the pastorals, there are a number of concerns that have been raised. One is writing style. There have been sophisticated analyses of the writing style of especially 1st Timothy and Titus that are very different from Paul's writing style. Timothy's a bit different because Timothy is different among the three. One of the things I argue in my book is that there are really good reasons for thinking that whoever wrote 1st Timothy also wrote 2nd Timothy, even though it's kind of done differently, but it's got so much in common, and that whoever wrote both of those also wrote Titus. Titus almost reads like a kind of an abbreviated version of 1st Timothy. And so I think you can take the three as a group. And when you take the three as a group, the writing style is very different. The themes are very different. Sometimes the author of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus will use a technical word that Paul uses that is used differently from the way Paul uses it, means something different. So just as an example, when Paul talks about faith in his writings, by faith, Paul does not mean something like an intellectual acceptance of a doctrine. I have faith that Jesus died for my sins. That's not like a statement a factual statement you agree with. For Paul, it's something. It's a trust. You trust Christ's death for your salvation. It's not like knowing a bit of knowledge. So it's not like saying, my faith is this, and then coming up with the Nicene Creed. This is my faith. This. I agree with all of these statements. It's not like that. For Paul, it's trusting that God has fulfilled his promises and trusting Christ to bring about salvation. It's a matter of trust. And for the author of the pastorals, faith is the central doctrines of the faith. Just different. Now, I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just saying it's not what Paul means by faith. But there are other examples of that. So you can never pick like an example and say, there it is. That's the smoking gun. What you do is you accumulate arguments. The writing style is very different. The vocabulary, just the vocabulary is very different, like massively different, the pastoral epistles from the other 7 letters. The theology is different. The presupposed historical situation is different. The church structure that Paul's addressing in the pastorals is different. The whole point of Paul's communities, just read 1 Corinthians. The way Paul's communities are constructed are as collections of groups of people who have all been baptized, who have each been given a gift by the Spirit that allows them to work together in community so that the church can function well together. Some are administrators, some are teachers, some are prophets, some are healers, some collect funds, some people who do various things, right? And they all work together for the functioning of the church. The church in Corinth is highly troubled, in part because these people can't get along. And so the idea of the Spirit unifying people through the gifts is not working too well. And you might wonder, well, why doesn't Paul just write the leaders of this church and say, look, get your people together? And say, look, your congregation is doing this, and that. You got to cut down on this. You got to make them stop. And Paul doesn't ever do that in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He doesn't write the leaders to tell them what to do. Why? Because there weren't any leaders. There were charismatic communities organized by the gifts, the charisma, the charismata of the Spirit. They're charismatic communities. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are not charismatic communities. These are well-structured hierarchies of churches where you've got a bishop, you've got deacons, you've got these various leaders in the church, and it's a structure. In this case, the author writes the leader and says, "Get your people in order." It's a different church situation that arose later when the chaos created by the charismatic communities fell apart. Almost certainly has to be near the end of the 2nd century, or the 1st century, end of the 1st century. So that's a list of kind of basic reasons, and it would take 3 hours to lay them all out in the detail. But it's the kind of thing that scholars have become really convinced. It's very rare that you'll find a critical scholar who's just trying to find out who wrote what, and it doesn't have any religious thing at stake. Just they want to know who thinks that Paul wrote these letters.
And when do you think the pastoral epistles were written?
Well, I'd say we don't really know. I mean, I think it's got to be after the life of Paul. It has to be after some developments happened after his death. They're usually dated, I suppose, to the end of the 1st century in the 90s sometime. And it's a guess. We don't really know. They're not included in Marcion's canon. It appears from the witness of these church fathers I mentioned that Marcion had 10 of Paul's letters in his canon, and that it did not include 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. There are several theories about that. One is that Marcion didn't like these books, that he found them to be incommensurate with his own views about things. A second theory is that Marcion simply had never heard of these books, that they weren't in wide circulation yet. I tend to agree with the second, but I don't think there's any way to know for sure.
What do you make of the claim that that I'm not sure if it's called the tomb of Paul, but more like the burial place of Paul, or where he was buried, was found with an inscription regarding the apostle martyr Paul?
Well, we don't have any idea where Paul was buried. I mean, you get later legends about everything. The earliest mention of Paul's death is in a book called First Clement. First Clement was almost certainly written around the year 95. And so before some of the books that made it into the New Testament. It's written by the Church of Rome that's addressing the church in Corinth. And it's just as Paul did. By the way, this book of First Clement, I think the dating is pretty secure, and it is clearly modeled on 1 Corinthians. And so that's one reason for thinking that Paul wasn't writing in the 130s, because the 1 Corinthians was written in the 130s, because 1 Clement is clearly modeled on it. So it had to be before 1 Clement, and there are really compelling reasons for thinking 1 Clement was written in the mid 90s. So Okay, so apart from that, it's a letter that claims to be written by the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth to deal with a problem that's arisen there, namely that there's been a coup in the church, that a group of the leaders of the church have been booted out of their leadership roles, and other people have taken over the control of the church. We don't know how it happened. We don't know what the mechanism was. We don't really have anything except for what this letter hints at. But the Roman church is upset about this and writes this letter to say that you need to reinstall the original leaders because you're creating chaos here. And, you're claiming to be leaders, but real leaders are willing to sacrifice their own interests to the church. And you're just asserting your own interest by desiring to be leaders when you weren't appointed as leaders. And to demonstrate how these leaders ought to behave, the author, it's a very long book where he gives lots of reasons for saying this. But at one point he says they should consider what Peter and Paul both did, that they both paid the price for their testimony by being martyred. And so this is written by the Roman Church, later is attributed to Clement, one of these early bishops of Rome, although it doesn't claim to be written by Clement. But so my point is that it talks about this about the death of Paul. It doesn't say he was martyred in Rome, though. Later, the tradition emerges that he got martyred in Rome, and our first account of his martyrdom is in this book I called The Acts of Paul. There's the last section of it, assuming that this is an integrated book. We just have fragments of it that people put together, but there's an account of Paul's martyrdom. And in that account, it's a very interesting account because Paul's martyred by being beheaded. And he's, so this is where you get the idea Paul was beheaded. And when he's beheaded, Paul's a saint of God. And so when he's beheaded, it's not a normal beheading. When the executioner beheads Paul, lops off his head, Paul lops off his head, and out of his neck spurts not blood, as you might expect, but milk. Milk? And so this is one of these texts that people wonder about. What's that all about? My view of it is that Paul has now entered into life. He's been born again. And what do you give to infants who have just been born? You give them milk. And so I think this is indicating that now he is moving on to a new birth, a new life. Anyway, where was he buried? We have no idea. So these are legends. So the tomb of Paul is a later kind of invention, just like so many other burial places, like the tomb of John in Ephesus.
I do want to state one thing real quick. Back to when we were discussing Nina earlier, she's not claiming Paul wrote in the 130s. She is saying that none of the epistles in the New Testament attributed to Paul were written by the historical Paul in the first century.
Well, okay, but I'm saying that 1 Corinthians almost certainly had to be written before 1 Clement, and that 1 Clement was written in 95. So it had to be written in the first century. Whether she wants to say Paul didn't write it, okay, then, again, that's great. Then you just need to look and see what would make you think so. And I'm completely open to Paul not having written it.
Can you tell us a little bit about the pseudo-Clementine literature, how they portray Paul, and the connections between Simon Magus and Paul?
Yeah. So this issue, let me begin with Simon Magus. This figure, Simon Magus, is mentioned in the book of Acts as a kind of magician figure who claims to have the power of God, but in fact is a magician and doesn't have the power of God. And he gets converted, and he wants to have the power that the actual apostles have because they have the power of Christ, and he doesn't. And he tries to bribe them to give them the power, and of course they can't. They can't do that, and there's no way they're going to do this because the Spirit has given them this power. And so he's this kind of nefarious figure who tries to be an apostolic impersonator in the book of Acts. The Pseudo-Clementine writings deal with this figure, the Simon Magus, as does this book, as does the book that I mentioned earlier called The Acts of Peter, where Peter goes to Rome and has a miracle working contest with this Simon Magus, legendary accounts of their miracle contest to see who's the greater apostle. The Pseudo-Clementines are books that claim to be written by this figure, Clement, that I just mentioned. So just some historical information. The church in Rome was founded by we don't know whom. It does not appear to have been founded by Peter. Certainly was not founded by Paul. Our first evidence of the church is by Paul in his letter to the Romans, where he writes the Roman church and explicitly states that he's never been there before. And so Paul didn't found this church. He wants to visit them because he's never met them. Paul greets a ton of people, over 20 people at the end of this book that he knows who happen to be there, and he doesn't mention Peter. So Peter doesn't seem to be there either. So we don't know who founded the church there. Somebody founded it. By the end of the first century, they, like other churches, had leaders. It may be there was a separate leader over separate house churches. Probably the Roman church was a large church meeting in different places. They didn't have church buildings yet. They have to meet in homes or in outdoor places. And each group within Rome, a big place at the time, about 1 million people, each church community probably had a leader, and they may have been called bishop. The word bishop comes from our word bishop translates the Greek word episkopos, which means bishop, but it really literally means overseer, someone who looks out for the congregation. And so there were probably a number of overseers or bishops. But the tradition develops later in the 2nd century that Rome had always had one leader, and it started with Peter. And then there's a guy named Linus, and you kind of go down the line. And Clement, depending on how you count, is the 3rd or the 4th of these bishops. So an early pope of Rome. He then, later on, there were lots of stories told about him because it was believed that Peter, or Peter and Paul both, were the ones who made him the bishop, who anointed him as the bishop of the church. Laid hands on him and did a ceremony to make him the bishop. So he became a famous figure. But the accounts of him are legendary. We don't have historical accounts about him. What we do have, this book, First Clement I mentioned, the later claim was that he wrote it, even though he doesn't mention, then his name does not occur in that long book. There's another book called Second Clement that also doesn't mention him, but people said, oh yeah, Clement wrote that one too. And then there are these two long narrative accounts that deal with Clement in relationship, this Bishop Clement, in relationship principally with Peter. Peter can, so the way these accounts work, there are two of them. One is called the Homilies. The other is called the Recognitions. These books were written in the 4th or 5th century. But they're based on earlier accounts that may go back to the 2nd century or something. They appear to be two distinct versions of some kind of original story or set of stories, possibly. So there are overlaps between the two, but they're also very different from one another. They give accounts of this Clement figure being originally a pagan who is converted by Peter and then travels with Peter around and joins him on his missionary endeavors and ends up, and so he's Peter's companion, so that's why he's famous. These accounts tend to be lining up with those Christians in the 2nd century and then later as well, who believed that in order to be a true follower of Jesus, it's important for people to keep the Jewish law. And so this is an idea that runs contrary to what the Apostle Paul historically preached. Paul was opposed to Gentiles having to keep the law. He was opposed to Gentiles having to convert to Judaism to be followers of Jesus. But these books share the idea that that's appropriate for them to that they should. And when Paul shows up in these accounts, he in fact is portrayed as an enemy of the true gospel. And in the letter that I mentioned from Peter to James, that is an introduction to the homilies that I mentioned, the Clementine, pseudo-Clementine homilies. They're called pseudo-Clementines because everybody agrees Clement did not write them. They're forgeries, so they call them pseudo-Clementines. One thing is Peter lambasting Paul as his enemy. The other is that there's an account in which Paul is responsible for the assassination of James, the brother of Jesus, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And so Paul does not come off well in the pseudo-Clementines.
And now I'd like to ask about the report of Pontius Pilate, and what does Tertullian have to say about that as well?
Right. So Pontius Pilate is a key figure, obviously, in the New Testament Gospels. He doesn't show up much, mainly at the end. At the end, he's the one who's responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. So massively important to the history of Christianity. The historical Pontius Pilate was a Roman official. He was one of the elite figures in Rome. He wasn't on the senatorial level. He wasn't on the very upper echelon of Roman aristocracy, but he was an equestrian. He was on the next level down, which is still extremely high up. And so he's in the 1%. And so he was a political figure who was appointed to be the governor of Judea in the year 29. So after the death of Herod the Great, there were lots of turmoil in what we think of as Israel. Eventually, the southern part, Judea, was assigned to a governor, and in the year 29, this Pontius Pilate figure became the governor of Judea, and he was the governor of Judea for 10 years, from 29 to 39 of the Common Era. And so it was during his reign that Jesus came to Jerusalem one Passover and was arrested by Jewish authorities, according to the Gospels, and who found him to be a troublemaker and turned him over to Pontius Pilate, who had him crucified for claiming to be the king of the Jews. Pilate would not have been, the historical Pilate would not have been interested in inner Jewish theological disputes or about people having one point of view or another point of view, or somebody violating like some taboo or something, or violating the law. He wouldn't care about that. He was concerned about people violating the peace and causing trouble. And if somebody's claiming to be the king of the Jews, that means the person's claiming to be the ruler of the Jews. Well, the Romans are the rulers of the Jews. And so the only way this person can become the ruler of the Jews is to start an insurrection. And so Jesus was crucified on grounds of insurrection against the state by the Romans. After that, people started wondering about Pontius Pilate. Not pagans. Pontius Pilate almost certainly had Jesus crucified, and he was crucified. Just according to the New Testament, there are two other people that day who were crucified. Probably a week later, Pilate didn't remember either of them. I suppose the next day they crucified a few more people, and a few more after that, and probably a few more the day before. And it's like, it's just like that's what's happening. And so Pilate didn't distinguish Jesus as being anybody. He's just a nobody that, was making a crazy claim. So he crucified him. But later Christians started thinking there had to be more to it. I mean, after all, Jesus was the Son of God. And Pilate must have known what he was doing. And so you end up with a string of legends about Pontius Pilate and a number of apocryphal works about Pontius Pilate. These are among the least known of the early Apocrypha by general readers, but they're fascinating and they're short, so they're easy to read. If anybody wants accounts of these other Gospels, including all of these accounts connected with Pilate, I have a book where I collected all of the other Gospels from outside the New Testament. It's just called The Other Gospels. And it's in paperback. You can buy this thing and you can read these accounts. This book that I did was with my colleague, Zlatko Plesha, who is a very good linguist. And what we did is we translated all the Greek, Latin, and Coptic Gospels of the first 400 years, a little bit beyond that in some cases, so that people could have access to them. And they include these Pilate Gospels. We call them the Pilate Gospels. And these Pilate Gospels are very interesting because they involve a Christian view of what Pontius Pilate was up to. One of them is called the Acts of Pilate. That one gives an account of Jesus, an alternative account of Jesus' trial. So it's a narrative account of Jesus' trial. The one you're asking me about is not a narrative account from Pilate's perspective. It's a correspondence. Pilate has some correspondence about Jesus that goes back and forth to the emperor. The emperor at the time is Tiberius. Tiberius was the successor of Caesar Augustus and was his son-in-law, and his stepson was his stepson. And he became the emperor after. And Tiberius was the emperor then when Jesus was crucified. And Pilate's the governor, so he's got to report back to the emperor. And so you get these very interesting pieces of correspondence in which Pilate, one of them, Pilate writes to Tiberius and says, basically apologizes and says that he's done a very bad thing. He actually crucified the Son of God. And he now realizes that was a mistake. And he's upset about it. Well, Tiberius is upset now too, because now he knows that the wrath of God is going to come down on Rome, and it's all Pilate's fault. And so he writes a letter and back to Pilate. And the way this ends up happening is Pilate gets summoned back to Rome. And then we have other accounts about Pilate in which we have an account called The Death of Pilate, where Tiberius confronts him and goes all over him because he knew that Jesus was doing all these miracles. He knew he was the Son of God. Why did he kill him? And Pilate makes excuses, blaming the Jews for doing it. He tries to shift the blame onto the Jews, but Tiberius decides to kill him anyway, and he has him executed. But the thing in this account, this is one of the great ones, Pontius Pilate, in this account, converts to be a follower of Jesus. And right before he gets executed, he prays to Christ and asks for forgiveness. And when his head gets lopped off, an angel comes down from heaven and takes his head up into heaven. So Pilate's residing in heaven now. So anyway, sorry, that's kind of a long answer because you're asking about one of these books, but the whole sequence is worth knowing about because they're all forgeries. The Acts of Pilate is not so much a forgery, it's a narrative account based on Pilate's point of view, but the correspondence between Pilate and Tiberius and these books are forgeries because they obviously were not written by these authors.
And are there also Pilate Gospels?
Oh, those are the Pilate Gospels. So there are no Gospels. We don't have any Gospels that tell Jesus' story from beginning and end in Pilate's name. What we have are these accounts that allegedly are these letters written by Pilate. And you had asked about Tertullian, but there's also, even before Tertullian, there's Justin Martyr. Both of them mention these legends about Pilate and Tiberius and how Tiberius actually came to believe Jesus was the Son of God, and about how you have a different account about what really happened according to Justin based on Pilate's account. And so you have references to this as soon as the year 150, but the accounts we have that we currently have were written later, principally in the 4th and 5th centuries, although they may be based on earlier ones.
And what about the Sibylline Oracles?
Right. The Sibylline Oracles are among the more famous of the non-canonical books, and they're kind of a complicated story. I'll say that to begin with. The Sibyl was a legendary mythical figure who was believed to be an ancient Roman prophetess. And according to Roman legend, before Christianity came along, in ancient Roman legend, the Sibyl had made mysterious proclamations about the future of Rome. And these proclamations were kept in Rome in the Temple of Jupiter as kind of prophecy books, that whenever something of moment, something scary, some kind of scary omen or some kind of scary event happened, there were a group of priests in Rome whose special duty was to interpret the Sibylline Oracles, to explain how they predicted what was going to happen so that they would know what was going to be happening next. These were real books, and there were real priests who were interpreting these things, but we don't have them anymore. They were destroyed in a fire. And then they were tried to be recollected, and there's kind of a long history to this. Sometime after these Sibylline Oracles had been like serious items in Roman political and religious policy, there were Jewish authors who wrote books that they claimed to be the Sibylline Oracles, to be written by the Sibyl. And later, there were Christians who took those books and modified them in Christian ways, putting in sections that were the Sibyl predicting the coming of Jesus. And so these were in circulation and were widely believed by Jews, and then especially by Christians, to have been authentic books written by this Roman prophetess who was predicting things that would happen at the end of time, and especially making detailed predictions about the coming of Jesus. And so we still have these Sibylline Oracles today. They were not written by a prophetess of Rome, and they are not the original Jewish version, although you can extract good portions of them, or the Jewish writings, but you can also detect which parts of the Christian writings, which would be Christians claiming to be the Sibyl. These were seen to be very useful because they involved a pagan prophetess predicting the coming of Jesus. And so these forgeries are serving a kind of evangelistic purpose and a kind of apologetic purpose, where Christians can defend themselves saying, look, it's not just the prophets of the Old Testament. We're not just talking about Isaiah and Amos and Micah predicting Jesus. We're talking about a pagan prophetess who was inspired by a divine being to predict the coming of the Savior. So if people want to read these Sibylline Oracles, they are very interesting. They're not in this book I talked about that I did, because they're largely Jewish and they're not Gospels. But there's a translation by John Collins, professor of early Judaism and Hebrew Bible at Yale. The full translation of his is in the 2-volume book called Old Testament pseudepigrapha and Apocrypha, or Old Testament Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. Maybe it's called Old Testament pseudepigrapha, I think it's called. Old Testament pseudepigrapha, 2 volumes, which is worth having because it contains all the pseudepigrapha of ancient Judaism. But I think you can probably find a separate copy just of John Collins' The Sibylline Oracles someplace, and you can read them there.
Michael E., thank you for your super chat. What was in the minds of early Christian pseudepigrapher and their audience? Is it always ideological or intended as early Christian fan fiction?
Yeah, it's a very good question. What I deal with in my book, both in my forge book that you mentioned and at a greater length in my forgery and counter-forgery book, is this entire phenomenon of pseudepigraphy. So scholars usually are reluctant or refuse to use the word forgery when it comes to early Christian writings, especially writings in the New Testament. They're reluctant to say, 2 Peter is a forgery. And the reluctance is based on, the understandable fact that these are parts of Scripture, and they think it's an offensive word, and they don't want to be offensive. And they also don't want to denigrate these writings, and so they call them pseudepigraphy. So a single pseudepigraphy is the phenomenon of writing something under a false name. That's what it literally means, written under a false name. A book like that is called a pseudepigraphon. A pseudepigraphon is a book with a false authorial inscription. The word pseudos actually means lie, means false, but a pseudos is a lie. And so it's an author who's lying about his name. And so that also could be an offensive term. The reason it's not offensive is because when a scholar says pseudepigraphon, nobody knows what he's talking about. So they're not offended. Whereas if they say forgery, what? Ah! So I get that and I understand it. The ancient writers used equally bad language about it. Not bad in the sense of swearing, but language that was offensive. So that pseudepigrapha, for what I'm calling forgeries in Greek, for example, there were a number of names for them and none of them good. The most common names, one was just to call them pseudoi, lies. The other name was the word in Greek that means illegitimate child. It's a nothos, an illegitimate child, but it had the negative connotations that our word bastard has. So bastard's it's an ugly word. It's a very, very ugly word. And so is nothos. But that's the most common word for these. And so when I said earlier that Didymus the blind said that 2 Peter is a forgery, he says it's a nothos with all the negative connotation. It's an illegitimate child because the person claimed as its father is not really its father. The author's not who he's claimed to be. That's why they called it that. That's one key to what people thought about pseudepigraphers in the ancient world. In my books, I go to great length to counter what everybody says who's never studied the issue. I counter what everybody told me when I was in graduate school, what my teacher said, what the book said. And when I started looking into this, I realized that these teachers and the authors of the books they're reading actually had not looked at the ancient evidence. Because what I learned in graduate school is that people who wrote these kinds of books, these pseudepigrapha, were not meaning to deceive anybody. Nobody was really deceived. It was just this kind of game everybody played along with. Or they would say it was a common practice in the ancient world and nobody condemned it. Or they would say this was commonly found among the philosophical schools of the ancient world. So there are like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or things like this that people would say to justify the practice. So then I decided to look into it, first by reading the massive scholarship on this. Unfortunately, most of the scholarship is in German. A lot of I hardly know anybody who's actually read these German books. Among New Testament scholars, they know about their existence. They could read them. They can read German, but I mean, they haven't bothered. So there's that. So I read all those, but then I started reading every reference I could find to forgery in the ancient world. I tried to find every reference I could to books like in Greek writings, in Greek and Latin literature, involving Greek writings, Roman writings, Jewish writings, and Christian writings. And I studied every one of these things, read them, took notes on them, and I came away with the conclusion that these other scholars, starting especially if you're a German reader, Wolfgang Speyer, wrote a book called Literary Pseudepigraphy in the Ancient World or something like that. I forget. You just read that stuff and you'll see, boom, 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 boom. What ancient people said about this was that it was an illicit practice. Nobody appreciated it. The only people who said anything about it that wasn't negative were people who got caught doing it. And when they did get caught, they were punished, either verbally, sometimes physically, sometimes murdered. And when they say nasty things about it, and about the process of doing this, and they talk about how they detected it, and so forth. We do have a couple of instances in which people were discovered to have done it, and they were not treated well. And so, what were the people doing it thinking? Well, we don't know. We don't know what's in their head. I've had a lot of people tell me, well, if it's so widely condemned, why was it practiced so much? And it makes me think, you mean like, cheating on your taxes? Or like committing adultery? Or like, you mean people wouldn't do it if it was widely condemned socially? Really? Is that your view? So why did people do it? Well, they wanted to for one reason or another. Did they think they were doing something wrong? Well, probably. Because in our culture, if you you probably know it's wrong. You might think it's okay for you to cheat on your taxes or to cheat on your spouse. You might think it's okay because you have reasons. So everybody has reasons. When it comes to pseudepigraphy, it looks to me like, so there are lots of reasons for doing it, and I provide an entire list of reasons and give examples of this from the Greek and Roman worlds and the Christian and Jewish worlds of why people did it. Sometimes in the Greek and Roman world is because you could sell these books and make some money. Sometimes it's in order to forge something in somebody else's name to make an idiot out of it. You publish your thing, and then the person makes an idiot out of himself, even though he didn't write it. So they're like this list of reasons for people doing this. But the most common reason, especially in Christian circles, the most common reason in Christian circles is because if you write in the name of somebody famous, you claim to be Peter, you claim to be Paul, somebody will read your book. You've got an important message to convey. And your name is, Anthony Schwartz from wherever. And it's like, nobody's even heard of you. You write your book and publish in your name. Who's going to read it? Okay. So then claim to be the Apostle John. And then people will read it. And so that's what happens. People claim to be John or James or Bartholomew or Philip or, pick your name. Matthew or Thomas or Peter or Paul. Just pick your name. You claim to be that person, and then somebody will read your book so that your points of view get across. So I think that that's what's going on. I think people knew that they probably thought, well, okay, technically this is wrong. It's a lie, but there's a bigger purpose here. I want to tell the world the truth, and I know the truth, and I'm going to tell them, and to get them to read it. So for their own good, I'm going to lie about who I am. And so even in books, like in the New Testament, the book of Ephesians stresses that you need to tell the truth. You need to be a truth teller. And the author who's saying that claimed to be Paul, even though he wasn't. He was lying about it. He knew he was lying about it. And so that's the irony that you get. So I think mainly in Christian circles, they're not playing a game, and they're not like pretending something, knowing that nobody's going to catch them. Or they really want people to read their books, and they think it's important enough to lie about.
I Fish Natalia, thank you for your super chat. Even with the forgeries, you believe Jesus was a historical figure and was crucified, correct?
Well, yeah, absolutely. The forgeries have nothing to do with it. The Gospels weren't forged. Paul's letters were not forged. And so we have abundant evidence. Josephus wasn't forged. It's like some people will often say, "Oh yeah, that bit in Josephus was added later," and I don't think so. I think people would like it to have been added later. But I think there's abundant evidence, and so the sources of the Gospels weren't forged. So yes, I absolutely think Jesus was a historical figure. I have a book on this called "Did Jesus Exist?" where I give the reasons for. It's not that I'm a believer in Jesus. But as a historian, I think it's really. I think the idea he did not exist is quite extreme. And nobody, people find convincing arguments because they want to find them. And if somebody gives them a complicated argument, they'll think it's convincing because it sounds complicated. But yeah, no, I think Jesus really did exist.
Independent thought, thank you for your super chat. How can the canonical gospels be independent sources for historical Jesus if they used each other as sources?
Excellent question. This is an excellent question. So when we say independent sources, what we mean is that you've got an account that an author has that is not shared in account that he borrowed from. And so, if you have an account of Jesus, for example, if you got an account of, let's say, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, let's say that you've got the same parable of Jesus, okay? And it's like, it's word for the word the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? We have good reasons for thinking that Matthew and Luke got many of their stories from Mark. And so if they got that story from Mark, you'd have three accounts of the story. They might be slightly different or greatly different, but they'd be the same story, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in that case, you do not have three independent sources for that story. You've got one source, Mark. And so in instances of what scholars call the triple tradition, meaning it's a story found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in those triple tradition stories, they're not independently attested. Sometimes you'll have stories you'll have sayings of Jesus, for example, that are found only in Matthew and in Luke. For example, our Father in heaven, holy be your name, the Lord's Prayer. Those passages that are in both Matthew and Luke, scholars have long thought came from a common source that Matthew and Luke had, that scholars call Q, a word for Quelle, meaning source in German. The Germans came up with this. They called it the sayings source, the sayings Quelle. And so instead of saying Quelle, now we say Q because it's spelled with a Q, Quelle. Well, if they both got this from Q, then we don't have two independent accounts of it. We've got one account. It doesn't exist anymore, Q, so we don't have two independent accounts. We have two dependent accounts, okay? So you have that. And so whenever you've got dependent accounts, then you don't have multiply independent witnesses. But sometimes you've got stories found in only one of the sources that is in a completely different form in another source, or doesn't exist in the other source. Or you have a saying in one source that has additional material in another source. So when that happens, there are aspects that can be multiply attested, as long as they're not word-for-word agreements or reasons for thinking that this detail comes from that source. So, for example, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples. Jesus is, see, how do I put this? Jesus is said to have been baptized in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Many of their stories about the baptism are similar. He associates with John the Baptist and then is baptized. John the Baptist is mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we have different stories about John the Baptist in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we have different stories about John as well in the Gospel of John. So if you've got those three that tell the same bit, that John, if they did say Jesus, that John baptized Jesus. Actually, Luke doesn't say that, interesting. But if it did say John baptized Jesus, then you'd say, well, we got that from all three. But if you got other things about John the Baptist in the context, some of it's in Luke, we didn't get it from, but not in the others, he didn't get from Matthew and Mark. If you got something in John and you think John did not rely on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is what I think, then John's also independent. And you start looking at this, when it comes to attesting John the Baptist, you have independent information from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew and Luke almost certainly did get parts of their thing from Mark about John the Baptist, but they didn't get the whole thing because Matthew has a whole episode not found in Mark. So he didn't get that from Mark, which means he's got episodes about John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. See what I'm saying? So the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist is independently attested, even though three of these gospels are dependent on each other. It's because they're not dependent on each other. Two of them are dependent on one, and two of them are dependent on a common source. But if you've got independent material about the same thing, so like another example, then it's independently attested because it's not all from the same source. Another example, Jesus tells parables about seeds. Well, Matthew and Luke got some of their parables of things about seeds from Mark, but they also have other parables of seeds. And the Gospel of Thomas has parables about seeds. Well, so Jesus telling parables, and specifically parables about seeds, is multiply attested. So Jesus probably told parables about seeds. Where it's not certain he did, but you start looking at that and other evidence, it seems pretty likely he did. And so that's how you do it. You cannot trust verbatim agreement. You cannot trust stories that they lifted from each other, but they have other stories about similar topics or similar figures, and use those kinds of things then to patch together what you have a good reason for thinking go back to Jesus. You're muted, Jacob.
Thank you. Off says, I like baby Jesus best.
Okay, well, fair enough. And, he probably never cried. And so, yeah.
Thank you for your super chat, Oaf. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Can Marcion's Pauline letters be recreated?
Yes, there have been a number of scholars who've tried to recreate both Marcion's version of Paul and Marcion's version of Luke. These sometimes they differ from one. It's a it's one of the most complex tasks that somebody can take on, a biblical scholar can take on, because it requires very strong philological skills and a very keen sense of analysis. So people who've done this in recent times, who've actually tried reconstructions, are I mentioned earlier Dieter Roth and Ulrich Schmidt. There's a fellow named Jason Badun. There are scholars who have tried this, and they don't have complete agreement with one another. Part of the problem is that our sources are problematic. Sometimes you cannot trust what Tertullian or Epiphanius says, and sometimes you don't know if you can trust them. But based on very, very careful analysis, that often in these cases, for Ulrich Schmidt and Dieter Roth, I know particularly, took years, and Jason Badun as well, took years to do. It's not easy.
MV, thank you for your super chat. I lost my hair after losing my faith. Should I go back? On a more serious note, can we know how many sources the authors used in the Gospels?
Definitely, you should return to the faith, and because or just go to a televangelist. I'm sure you could get your hair back if you wanted to. I don't, because I don't want to. On the serious note, no, we don't know how many sources. What scholars typically do is when they talk about the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they typically talk in terms of, well, it depends which theory you hold. My theory, I hold the theory that I call the four document hypothesis, which is that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. Matthew and Luke also had access to another source that I called Q just now. So the stories all three have in common come from Mark. The sayings Matthew and Luke have that are not found in Mark come from Q. Matthew has his own stories found only in Matthew. He didn't get them from Mark or Q. So we call that M for Matthew's source. Matthew's source may be a bunch of sources. It may be a written source. It may be multiple written sources. It might be oral sources, lots of oral sources. We don't know. Is it 1? Is it 20? Somewhere in between. We don't know. Luke has stories found only in Luke. We call Luke's special source L. And so is it one written source, lots of written sources, lots of oral sources, lots of both? We don't know. So the four source hypothesis that I hold to, which has been the standard view for over a century now among New Testament scholars, is we call them four sources: Mark, Q, M, and L, with the proviso that M and L might be many sources. Some people don't subscribe to that model. There's a new model that it's not a new model. It's been all these models have been around for roughly forever, but a model that my friend and colleague Mark Goodacre supports is a somewhat simpler model where there are fewer sources, where he thinks that Mark was the source for Matthew, and Luke used both Matthew and Mark. So the Luke has some of Mark with Matthew and some of Matthew without Mark, and so that's how you get Luke with his own stuff. And so that's called it's called the Farrer hypothesis, the Farrer named after the person who came up with it. And it's somewhat simpler because it gets rid of Q, but it creates huge problems as well. So huge that most people don't buy it, that I'm not going to get into. But so, okay, I guess I could have just said, we don't know. But I would say it's at least four and probably many more.
I Fisher, hi, thank you for your super chat. Ariston of Smyrna, an eyewitness of Jesus, noted in manuscript Eshmaidzin 229 has been credited with authorship of the long ending of Mark. Thoughts?
Yeah, this is not an authentic eyewitness of Jesus. This is a later forged idea, fabricated idea, and there's nothing that would tie anyone named Ariston to the longer ending. I mean, I know you'll hear things like that, but if you actually look into Ariston, you'll see of Smyrna that he's not a historical figure living at the time of Jesus.
King Doe, thank you for your super chat. If Paul was rewritten or produced in later times, then they would not be so certain about the apocalypse.
I'm not sure what he means about not so certain about the apocalypse. Do you know what he means? Is he talking about the apocalypse of Paul, the apocalypse of John? Some people think that the apocalypse of I bet I know what he means, or she means what this person means. Some people have argued, including Elaine Pagels, that the apocalypse of John is directed against the teachings of Paul, and especially with respect to the idea of eating food offered to idols, and that there's some anti-Pauline material in the book of Revelation, which is, I think, again, almost certainly to be dated to the 90s of the Common Era. And that would presuppose, if it's true that it's opposing Paul, it would presuppose that Paul wrote before it. And so that would be right. I am not at all convinced that the book of Revelation is attacking Paul or Pauline thought. I wrote a book. My most recent book is called Armageddon, and it's about the revelation of John. And it tries to provide an interpretation of the revelation of John that makes sense in its own historical context. I show it must have been written in the 90s. And I don't have much on the Paul hypothesis there because I just don't think there's much to it. It's the kind of thing that kind of sounds impressive. I think when you dig into it, in my view, it's not a compelling argument.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Is it possible you could do a course showing how human activity and textual evidence at Noah's flood, according to the Bible, didn't happen?
Yes, I've already done that. So if you go to my courses online, if you don't know, I have online courses that I've produced for a couple years now. And also, I've started having other people produce courses. This last weekend, Amy Jill Levine, one of the superstars in New Testament studies, did a 4-lecture course for us on the parables. You can find all these, the courses we've done so far at bartehrman.com. And it's a webpage, and just click on courses, and you'll see all of them. I did might have been the first course I did. It was on the book of Genesis. And it was an 8-lecture course on the book of Genesis, where I talked about, among many other things, I talked about the historicity of these old stories. I talked about problems with the creation stories and talked about the Adam and Eve story, but I talked about the problem with the flood stories and why there are contradictions in the flood story. There are actually a couple stories that have been combined together. And there are, of course, there are very big problems, including the fact that geologists have shown pretty convincingly there's no worldwide flood. Plus, it couldn't happen. But apart from that, I do talk about that. So it's a book. It's my class on Genesis. It's called In the Beginning, and you can find out about it on my website, bartehrman.com.
Take one more super chat before I get back to my questions. Fish in a tie, thank you for your super chat. Just an FYI, I pray for you to return to the faith daily, Dr. Ehrman.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate it. I am not, I'm not an enemy of the faith, even though some people say I am. I have no difficulty with people of faith. I have difficulty with people who don't apply their intelligence to their faith. But I've known many Christians who are far more intelligent than me. And so it's not a matter of smarts. And if it's something that makes sense to you, and it's something that makes you a better person, and it makes you someone who helps others in our world, then I'm all for it. So thank you. I appreciate your prayers.
What forgeries were in conflict with false teachers?
That's a good question, and I think the answer is most of them. So my book, the big book I called Forgery and Counterforgery. The full title is "The Use of Literary Deceit in Early Christian Polemics," or polemic. And Christian polemic is attacks on people for thinking the wrong things or for doing the wrong things. But a lot of my book is dealing with how there are forgeries directed against various perspectives. There are forgeries that oppose Jews, and there are forgeries that oppose pagans, but there are a lot of forgeries that oppose heretics, people who subscribe to the incorrect set of beliefs. And so, as I said, there are a number of them, and they just like of the ones we've mentioned so far. For example, 3 Corinthians is a classic example of a letter claimed to be by Paul to attack a view that's called Docetism, the view that Jesus wasn't really human, but only appeared to be human. So that's a frontal attack. The book I called the Apocalypse of Peter, the one that I said is the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. It's a Gnostic forgery. It's written by a Gnostic who has Peter allegedly watching the crucifixion of Jesus and not understanding why the person being crucified, the human Jesus, isn't the same as the divine Jesus, the Christ. Peter has the realization that Jesus and Christ are 2 separate beings. And this book is attacking the people who think that Jesus Christ is one being and that Christ died on the cross for your sins. He's attacking that view, and he says that the people who hold it, the bishops, are dry canals. In other words, they're supposed to be filled with living water, but there's nothing there. They got nothing there to argue with. Jesus was not the Christ. Jesus was the man that the divine element, the Christ, temporarily inhabited. Christ can't be crucified. He's God. God can't suffer. God can't die. What's wrong with those Orthodox people? And so the author wouldn't call them Orthodox. He'd say those heretics over there. So he's attacking heresy. So all sides are writing forgeries to attack the other side. The letter of Peter to James that I mentioned and talked about is written by somebody who's a Jewish Christian who thinks that to be a follower of Jesus, you cannot follow the teachings of Paul. You've got to keep the law. And so there are all these, like, I'd say the preponderance of forgeries in the Christian tradition are written against people who believe the wrong things.
Did the early church fathers also have issues with some of the letters attributed to Paul, both in the New Testament and outside the New Testament? Did they dispute some of them at all?
Are you saying the letters of Paul specifically?
Yes.
Yeah. No, there were disputes about a number of the letters. There were disputes about some that made it into the New Testament. For example, the letter of 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, they were disputed by some church leaders and suspected by some church leaders. The ones outside the New Testament, there were some that church leaders talked about them, and they would sometimes say, this is a forgery. They sometimes, there were debates, for example, about this letter to the Laodiceans, whether it could be authentic or not. The letter of 3 Corinthians that I've talked about, debated whether it was authentic or not. And so church fathers were aware of the phenomenon of forgery. One interesting phenomenon we have is that in our earliest, probably our earliest list of which books belong in the New Testament, it's called the Muratorian Fragment. It's called the Muratorian Fragment because it's a fragment. It's just a little piece of writing. It's written in Latin. It's a later writing, but it's copying an earlier list that looks like came from the 2nd Christian century, a list of what this anonymous author thought were the books of the New Testament. And the author includes, it's a fragment, it begins kind of in the middle of a sentence. It begins by saying, it says a couple words and it says, and our 3rd gospel is Luke, and the 4th gospel is John. And then it gives, and so it has It apparently had all 4 of our Gospels, apparently, and it lists letters of Paul, lists Acts, it lists some things. And there are differences from the canon that ended up being the 27-book canon. There are differences between this and that. But one interesting thing is it mentions some letters of Paul that we don't have, including a letter to the Alexandrians. So this apparently was a letter known to this author, presumably in the late 2nd century, that was allegedly written by Paul to the Christian church in the city of Alexandria. Boy, we'd love to have that, love our hands on that one. But so church fathers do comment on Pauline forgeries, and they comment on ones we don't even have.
What is the problem with Colossians and its alleged authenticity to Paul?
So I've been mentioning there's 7 letters that most scholars agree are authentically Pauline. There are 6 that are debated. The 6 are usually divided into 2 groups. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, those 3 I said probably have the same author, and they are usually called the pastoral epistles, because Paul is writing to these pastors of churches, telling them how to get their churches in order. So they're pastoral advice to pastors, so it's pastoral epistles. The other 3 are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. These are, I would say that there are more scholars who will say that one or the other might be authentic than with the pastorals. And of those, I would say most scholars would agree Ephesians probably is not written by Paul. There's some more doubt about Colossians and some more doubt about 2nd Thessalonians. The majority view still is they're not authentic. Colossians and Ephesians have similar problems to one another. Colossians and Ephesians both have a writing style that is very different from Paul's at a very deep level, in a way you wouldn't notice if you're reading it in English translation. So there are scholars who've written entire books on this, especially Colossians. There's a very, very learned book on the authorship of Colossians that deals with stylistic features of Colossians in relationship to Paul's undisputed letters. And it isn't the kind of thing where it just looks at, boy, that sounds different. It's looking at things that you wouldn't, when you write things, a lot of times you're very conscious about how you're writing. You're conscious about how you construct a sentence or how you use a prepositional phrase or something. There are things you think about. There are a lot of things you don't even think about. Like in Greek, there are several words for the word and. So you can say and or but or therefore, and they're different conjunctions that basically mean the same thing. And some people use one more often than the other, and most people use both, but they tend to use one more than the other, and that kind of thing. Or there are lots of ways you can use participles in Greek. It's a complicated thing studying participles, or how infinitives are used in Greek. And these are just like how people use these things. And often this is the kind of thing you don't think about too much. So there are these studies that will go into great detail that which conjunction does Paul use in his letters? And these letters, how much does he use in Colossians? How do prepositional phrases work? How do infinitives work? How do embedded clauses work? In other words, like one simple way of putting that is, it's kind of like how long is a sentence? But an embedded clause is when you have a sentence which goes on forever because the author has other clauses connected to them that could be sentences of their own, but in fact are used by the author in order to stick them in the same sentence. And so the sentence goes on for 3 paragraphs. It seems like 3 paragraphs. And in English, they often are 3 paragraphs. But in Greek, it'd be like one sentence. Oh my God, does Paul ever do that? And you look and say, yeah, no. So the thing what you do is you look at every metric you can stylistically and you put it together and it's just like time after time after time after time. It's different. So it's like, it isn't just one thing, it's like all of these things all move in the same direction. And then you look at the theology. Paul, I'll give you just an example that I think is pretty telling. In Paul's letter to the Romans and elsewhere in Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, Paul is definite that the Christians have not yet been raised from the dead. Christians who have been baptized have died with Christ, but they haven't been resurrected yet. That comes when Jesus returns. So in Romans 6, Paul uses his verb tenses very carefully. You have died with Christ and you will be raised with him. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is emphatically arguing against people who think that Christians have already experienced a spiritual resurrection with Jesus. Paul emphatically argues, no, the resurrection is not a spiritual experience that has already happened to believers. It's a physical experience that's going to happen at the end of time, when we will be transformed like Christ's body was transformed. We haven't been transformed yet. The resurrection has not yet happened. That's Paul's argument. And he makes it consistently through these 7 letters. When you get to Colossians, the author of Colossians says, we've died with Christ and we've been raised with him. We've already been raised with Christ. It's just the opposite of what Paul said in the other. So I don't know. You could say Paul changed his mind. Of course. Okay, he changed his mind. Yeah, okay. Except the stylistic things are all different too. And so you pile all this stuff up and you end up with, Colossians. I don't think it can be written by Paul.
What about Ephesians?
Well, okay. So the same thing with the Ephesians, only Ephesians is like Colossians on steroids when it comes to these things. The same issues I was just talking about, even more so for Ephesians. But there are other things that are even more interesting about Ephesians. One is that you have these passages that sound so much like Paul until you start looking closely at them. So I'm not going to give a full exegesis here, but I give a clear example from Ephesians chapter 2, which talks about how we were dead in our sins and trespasses, but now we've been raised, and how you say by grace, not by grace, not by works, and you consider all these things that he says, and it sounds like Paul on the surface until you see how the words are being used. The words are being just the opposite how Paul uses the words. I'll give you just like one example. When Ephesians says that you're saved by grace alone, not by works. Okay, this is in chapter 2. For by grace you have been saved, not by works, for by works, whatever. So you're not saved by works. Fine. Well, that just sounds like Paul, right? That's what he says in Romans. That's what he says in Galatians. No, it's not. When Ephesians is talking about not being saved by works, he means you're not saved by doing good deeds. You're not saved because you're such a moral person and you help old ladies across the street and you volunteer at the soup kitchen and all that's going to save you. No, it's not for Ephesians. God saved you by his grace. Okay, fine. Well, that's what Paul says, right? No, it's not what Paul says. When Paul talks about being saved by faith, he says, not by works of the law. Paul is not talking about doing good deeds. He's talking about keeping the Jewish law of circumcision and kosher food laws and festivals and Sabbath. He's talking about prescriptions that make Jews Jewish. Jews do not get into the kingdom for keeping the law, even if they keep it pretty well. That's not what saved you. The death of Christ saved you. So it sounds like Paul, but it's not what he's talking about. You add that to these statements that are easy. Even Ephesians is even more extreme on the idea that we've been raised with Christ. We're already seated with Christ in the heavenly places for Ephesians. And so this is just not what Paul says at all. So I think that's why Ephesians is more of a problem than Colossians even.
And 2 Thessalonians?
Okay, so 2 Thessalonians is a completely different issue. 2 Thessalonians sounds a lot like Paul in places, so much so that it looks like whoever wrote 2 Thessalonians was copying parts of 1 Thessalonians, like an entire sentence. It's like, man, that's almost exactly like, and which is interesting because Paul never does that. When you read 1 Corinthians and then you read 2 Corinthians, there's nothing in 2 Corinthians, which is a line taken from 1 Corinthians. How would somebody do that? Did he like memorize this line he wrote? Do you memorize the lines you write when you write a letter? So how does he do that? Well, if he had the letter in front of him and he was trying to imitate Paul, that would make sense. He had the letter. Wants to sound like Paul? He copies Paul. 2 Thessalonians sounds like Paul in lots of places. When it doesn't sound like Paul, the views expressed are contrary to Paul's. So I lay this out in both of my books. Like the best example of this is First Thessalonians. The point of First Thessalonians, you can find it expressed in every chapter of the 5 chapters. It especially comes to the 4 when Paul hits the climax of the book in chapter 4 and 5. The Thessalonians, it turns out, are concerned that people in their congregation have died already before Christ returned. And they thought Jesus was coming back right away. Paul told them that. He's coming back right away. And now they're thinking, wow, these people have died. Have they lost out on their reward? And, oh no, like they're not going to be here when Jesus comes back. So Paul writes the letter to assure them, no, don't worry about it. When Jesus comes back, the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will join them. It's important to notice how he says, we who are alive at the time. He's including himself as one of those who's going to be alive at the time. He thinks it's coming soon. That becomes very clear when you get to chapter 5. One problem people have with reading 1 Thessalonians is that the discussion of Jesus returning in glory and people being taken up into the air to meet him is in chapter 4, and then they stop there and they don't keep reading. Stopping there is why people believe in the rapture. The rapture is the idea is that Jesus is coming back to take his people out of the world to save them so that 7 years later, when he returns, he'll destroy the world and they won't be there to see. They won't be there for the destruction during the 7-year tribulation. Won't be the destruction at the end. They're going to be up there with Jesus. That's what you take away if you stop reading at the end of chapter 4. But when Paul wrote this book, he wasn't writing chapter 4 and then stopping and then putting chapter 5 next topic. He didn't write with chapters and verses. After the last line of chapter 4, he wrote the next line of what's now chapter 5. They go together. And when you go together in chapter 5, you start realizing he's talking about the coming of Jesus not to take people out of the world. He's coming to destroy his enemies. And he says that this is going to happen suddenly. Be on the alert. It could happen at any time. You've got to watch. You've got to be ready because it's going to happen. That's 1 Thessalonians. The end is coming soon. It didn't happen, but it's going to happen right away. You need to be ready. When you get to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, you have the author the point of 2 Thessalonians is that people are so sure the end is coming soon that they're not paying attention to their present life. And this author is writing the letter to explain that the end is not coming right away. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the author says, don't be put off by a letter allegedly by us saying that the end is coming soon. Look, it's not coming right away. There's a string of events that have to happen first. So you will know when it's ready to come. And he describes one of the things that has to happen is that the enemy of God, the figure that people often will call the Antichrist, first has to go into the temple of God and declare himself God. And then the force that is holding back the powers of evil will be let them go. And so there's this sequence of events that have to happen, including this figure opposed to Christ and God, declaring himself God, and then all hell breaking out. In other words, these things have to happen first. So don't be put off by somebody who's telling you it's going to happen right away. Well, that's what 1 Thessalonians says. You got to be ready. So is it like Paul changed his mind 2 weeks later? I mean, it's like, what? And so, boy, that sure doesn't look like it's written by Paul. So the parts that look like were written by Paul are ones that seem to be they're very, very close to 1 Thessalonians, because an author apparently is like copying bits or imitating bits. The parts that are his own composition are saying the opposite. So you get somebody to read that. And then what people do is they read 2 Thessalonians and they use Paul's second letter, to interpret 1 Thessalonians. And so they're using the forgery to interpret the Pauline and say, oh man, don't do it that way.
What do you make of attempts to try to harmonize all these letters via co-authorship or the secretary hypotheses?
So co-authorship theories are that Paul co-wrote his letters with others, as he says. He'll sometimes start off by saying, Paul and Timothy, to the Christians who are in, to the beloved of the saints, and so on. And so he'll start off by naming himself and another author, such as Timothy. And so some people have argued, look, if they're co-authored, you'd expect them, to be different because the co-authors are going to write differently. I had to look into this pretty seriously when I was doing my work on Paul for my books. And I noted that nobody has ever demonstrated that co-authored letters affect the style of the letter, because I think the reason is because co-authored letters are never co-authored. When Paul says, I and Timothy are writing you, he means I'm writing you and I'm with Timothy and we're both sending this letter to you, but there's one person writing the letter. You don't have people like alternating pens, like here, okay, you write the next sentence. Okay, I'll write the next. These are not committee products. And one evidence of that is that Paul uses the first person singular in these letters. He'll say Paul and Timothy, and then he'll say, I remember you in all my, it's in the first person, and he gives greetings in his own name. And so like Timothy is with him, but he's not co-authoring the letter. So there are two things. One is there's no evidence that co-authored letters ever differed. Like if you one author with different co-authors, there's nobody that's shown any literary differences among those letters. Secondly, Paul was not actually co-authoring these letters. He has somebody who's with him that he's sending greetings to, and he's saying they're sending this letter with me, but he's actually doing the writing of the letter. So there's that. So to say that since he co-authored one letter, not like, it just doesn't, I don't think it works. The secretarial hypothesis is more commonly argued. And I think I also used to think it. I used this sort of thing I thought because people told me it was true. And so I assumed it was true. That sometimes in the ancient world, secretaries wrote letters for people. And so, that's what happened. And so for an example of this is 1 Peter. A lot of people use this argument for 1 Peter that well, okay, maybe Peter, an Aramaic speaking person, who said to be illiterate in the book of Acts, so he couldn't write, and his language is Aramaic, and so and 1 Peter is written this high level Greek, and so it seems unlikely Peter would have written it, but a secretary wrote it for him. There are roughly 2 billion people in the world who believe this. And so I got really serious and started looking into what we know about secretaries in the ancient world. And a lot of what scholars say about it just is not true. If you look at what we know about ancient secretaries, when by secretary in this context, we mean somebody who's taking dictation at what an author says, writing down what the author says. And so a secretary in that sense. There were secretaries in the ancient world. Authors did use secretaries in the world. We know things about these secretaries because we have information about them that comes to us from the ancient world. You're better off trusting what they say in the ancient world than reading what somebody said about it in 1997. Somebody who didn't actually look at all the references in the ancient world. In the ancient world, there are different ways these scribes would operate. They would be taking dictation. They would hear what the author is saying. Sometimes they do it word for word. Sometimes if they were slow, they'd have to maybe go letter by letter. Sometimes they do phrase by phrase. Sometimes the author would look over the thing and correct it. Many times the author would not do it. But the scribe is taking down what the author wrote. We have only a very few instances, like a couple in Cicero, like a couple of instances where we know that that somebody gave a secretary the job, look, write this letter for me. In those cases, the secretary was writing a form letter, a kind of letter that the author always, look, just tell them I can't come to their dinner party. And so it'd be a short little, with apologies, I will not be able to attend your dinner party. I have other obligations. Be a few lines, and then the secretary would sign the name Cicero. So that did happen for that kind of letter. We have no evidence of a scribe composing an essay. 1 Peter is an essay. It's 5 chapters long. It's not a few lines. It's 5 chapters long that is constructed in a very sophisticated way that uses rhetorical language, or uses rhetorical style, using Greek rhetorical methods, and has common rhetorical tropes in it, that is written by a highly educated Greek-speaking person. The choices are that Peter wrote it himself. He couldn't write in Greek like that. he dictated the letter. He couldn't dictate it in Greek that way. He didn't know Greek like that. He might have had, if he was on the mission field, maybe he had some clumsy Greek he could communicate with, like, somebody who comes to visit our country from another place, might put together a few, some sentences, or maybe can even carry on a conversation, but they can't write First Peter. and my students who have 12 years of education in English, including English composition, could never write First Peter. This is a high level person. So, okay, well, maybe he dictated it in Aramaic, and the secretary then translated it into Greek and put it in fine rhetorical style. Or maybe Peter told the secretary basically what to write, and he wrote it for himself. Okay, those would be two options that would work if they ever happened. What is our evidence that ever happened in the ancient world? Ever? I don't know of a single instance. So if somebody knows of single instances, they need to tell me, because I looked into it. That's what would be required. And so far as I know, it never happened. So you can think it if you want. Peter says that I wrote this letter through Sylvanus. So people say, oh, Sylvanus was the actual author. He must have been a Greek-speaking person. Well, when people end their books that way, I wrote letters that way. When they say I wrote through this person, what they mean, you can do a word study of this. What it means when you say dia, name a person, is the person through whom you write the letter. What it means is this is the letter carrier. This is the person who's bringing you the letter. It's not the guy writing the letter. And so, people can think that Peter wrote it if they want to say that's how he wrote it. But what is more likely to have happened? Something that happens all the time, including with Peter. In other words, someone claiming to be Peter when he wasn't. That happened a lot, probably a lot more than we even know about. Is it more likely that happened, that somebody forged a book, which happened a lot apart from Peter, or it's something that never happened to our knowledge, which is more likely? So it just seems to me more likely the thing that commonly happens is more likely. If you think the other thing's what happened, then I need evidence of it.
What do we know about Gnostic and anti-Gnostic forgeries?
Well, I mentioned Gnostic forgeries because I mentioned the Apocalypse of Peter, which is a Gnostic forgery. We have a Orthodox forgery by an Orthodox Christian who wrote the Greek Apocalypse of Peter, which is all about this journey to heaven and hell. In my book, I argue that in fact one of them is writing against the other one of them. Interestingly, but I think the Gnostic one is probably being written against the other one. We have Gnostic forgeries, which are attacks on. They're not always attacks. We have a lot of Gnostic forgeries. The so-called Gnostic Gospels, so the Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in the 1940s, in 1945, contained a number of books that claim to be by authors who did not write them. They're not all that way, but there are books, for example, the Gospel of Thomas, which claims to be written by Judas Didymus Thomas. Sorry, it's getting late. My brain's going dead. Which is allegedly Jesus' twin brother. Well, he didn't write it. We have a Gospel of Philip, the disciple Philip. Well, he didn't write it. So these are books written by Gnostics claiming to be people who weren't. And you have anti-Gnostic writings, which are written by Orthodox writers who are opposing Gnosticism. And so you could see the book of Third Corinthians that way. They might be opposing a form of Gnosticism. And so you have people on both sides forging books. And the interesting thing is that when you have scholars talking about, or ancient Christians talking about one set of books of forged, you say, well, those are forgeries. Those are spurious. Those are nothoi. Whereas when the Christian book, you say, well, those are, but it was common practice in those days, so it was okay. Yeah.
And what about in regards to the doctrine of Adai, the supposed correspondence between King Abgar of Edessa and the historical Jesus?
Well, this is a very interesting forgery. It's actually two forgeries. that is the only full correspondence that survives from the hand of Jesus. People often ask me, are there any forgeries attributed to Jesus? There are a couple, but this is the only one that is like a full-fledged actual writing of Jesus. The situation is described in two of our ancient sources. And we actually have the thing Jesus wrote and the letter that he's responding to. King Abgar is the king of Edessa in Syria, according to this ancient legend. Abgar, king of Edessa, who is very ill while Jesus is alive, and he has heard. He's not a Christian. He's a pagan, but he's heard that there's this great miracle worker in Israel, Jesus, and he would like Jesus to come heal him, and so he writes Jesus a letter, and we have this letter. And Abgar says, I'm very ill. I understand that you're a wonder worker. Would you please come and heal me of my sickness? Jesus gets the letter, and he writes one back that we have, where Jesus says that he's unable to come to help Abgar because the basic line is, I've got other things on my hands. I have to go get crucified in Jerusalem. And so he's busy. Sorry, I can't come. He has to go face his fate. But he said, I will send one of my followers after my death. And according to the tradition, he sent one of his followers to Abgar after he died. He commissioned one of his followers to go to Abgar. The follower went to Abgar, healed him of his sickness, and the entire city of Edessa, large city, the entire city converted to Christianity on the spot. And so that's the legend. And but we still have both of those letters. Nobody thinks they're authentic.
What about the letters of Paul and Seneca?
Right. So these are very interesting letters because throughout the Middle Ages they were assumed, and down to modern times, they were assumed to be authentic. Unlike a lot of these other ones that were branded as heretical or, obviously not written by so and so. These letters were thought to be actual letters. So we have a group of letters, 14 letters that are an exchange of letters between the Apostle Paul and the greatest Roman philosopher of his day, Seneca. Seneca, for many people today, is just kind of a name of an ancient person they kind of heard of, but don't really know anything about. He was one of the most important figures of the Roman world in Paul's day. He nearly became the Roman emperor. He's most famous for being an advisor to the Emperor Nero. Nero had Seneca, who was a philosopher, trained philosopher, very, very sophisticated, deep thinker, very sober thinker, a Stoic. He was a Stoic philosopher, one of the Roman Stoic philosophers, one of the very famous Stoic Roman philosophers, who wrote a lot of treatises that we have. We have a number of his Stoic treatises that are really worth reading, very powerful and moving. And we have letters, a number of letters that he wrote. So he was advisor to Nero, so historically, I'm talking about the historical figure Seneca, and was one of the wealthiest human beings in the Roman world. Next to Nero, he was one of the very top wealthiest people, massive land holdings. So he was extremely rich and extremely famous and extremely well known for his very deep philosophy. So we have a set of letters allegedly between him and Paul. And so so he writes Paul and greets him, and he congratulates him on having such fine thoughts. And Paul writes him back, and they have a back and forth. And at one point, Seneca says that he's shown his letters and Paul's letters to Nero, who really thinks highly of Paul. And so they go, and so these letters go back and forth. Unfortunately, there's very little information in these letters that you'd really like. Like, there's not much meat in these, apart from Seneca praising Paul's great intelligence and great letters. At one point, wishing that he wrote Latin better. his Latin skills were kind of minimal, according to Seneca. He needs to improve his Latin, and at one point, he does mention the fire in Rome that happened in the year 64 under the reign of Nero. It's But otherwise, there's very little historical information or gossip. What you really would like are some courtroom some gossip from the royal court, but no, you don't get much. And so there's a fairly banal exchange, the point of which seems to be to show that Paul was important enough in the Roman world. He wasn't just a nobody. He wasn't like a tent maker off in the boonies someplace. He was oh my God, he had high connections. He was connected with one of the most wealthy men in the empire. And the greatest philosopher who praises him for his brilliance. So it's meant to elevate Paul, these letters. Nobody today, they were shown to be forgeries in the 18th century, and they are absolutely forgeries. And there are lots of reasons for thinking so. One of which is that Seneca read Greek. Paul didn't have to write in Latin. But apart from that, there's really good reasons for thinking these are forged. But they're forged for a different reason. In this case, they're not forged to combat a heresy or to attack. They're forged to demonstrate Paul's importance.
What is the Epistola Apostolorum, and when was it created?
The Epistola Apostolorum, literally, that it's one of those strange writings from the ancient world that scholars continue to call by its Latin name, even though there's a perfectly good English name. I'm not quite sure why we do that sometimes and not others, but we do. Like we say the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, when we could just say, the Proto-Gospel of James. The Epistola Apostolorum means the Epistle of the Apostles. It's allegedly written by the 12 apostles. It is a book that is clearly not written by the apostles. And it is a book that is affirming a non-docetic understanding of Christ, where Christ is emphasized as being fully human, and the apostles are stressing this idea that Christ is a full human being. He's not an image. He's not a mirage. He's not God as a ghost. He's actually a human being, in opposition to heretics who might be Gnostic, might be something else, who are saying that Jesus was a phantom.
And when was it created?
It's a 2nd century text, late 2nd century.
Can you tell us the difference between a fabrication and a falsification?
Yes. So in both of my books, I try to stress that it's important to keep our designations clear and straight. Because people confuse things, and it just gets confusing. It's not that one word has to mean one thing or another. I mean, words can mean whatever you want, but if you want to communicate with people, you need to agree on what a word means. And so in my book, I try to clarify the difference between words. So the words you asked about are fabrication and falsification. Let me first put them in contrast with forgery. Forgery, I said, is when an author claims to be somebody that he's not, when he's claiming to be a famous person knowing full well he's not. Fabrication is when somebody makes up a story and tries to pass it off as something that actually happened. So you make up a story about Jesus. It didn't really happen, but you say it happened. And so the Gospel of Thomas has a story, the infancy Gospel of Thomas has a story of Jesus making 12 clay sparrows come to life. It didn't happen. Somebody fabricated that story. The story's not a forgery in the way I'm using it. It's not making a false authorial claim for itself. The story's not. The story is a fabrication. So a forgery is a false authorial claim. A fabrication is a fictional story passed off as factual. A falsification is when somebody is taking a text, a written text, and changing it, falsifying what it says, for example, by adding something to it that the author did not write, or taking away something that the author did write, or altering the words of an author as he wrote them. That is falsifying the text. It's not forging the text. It's not fabricating the text. It's falsifying the text. That's what Christian scribes often did. And so in my book, Misquoting Jesus, where I talk about how scribes changed their texts, those are falsifications. Sometimes it's falsified intentionally. A scribe wants to change something. Sometimes it's just falsified. It's not the scribe's fault. He just he makes a mistake or falls asleep or gets tired or whatever. But those are falsifications.
Can you tell us about the unknown life of Jesus Christ forgery?
Well, I'll tell you about this kind of forgery. So in my book Forged, I decided to end on a rather fun note. I don't do this in my serious book because it's already too long, and plus it wasn't. But for the last chapter of my book on Forged, I wanted to talk about the fact that this kind of thing continues, where people will write accounts of Jesus' life claiming to be apostles. Or sometimes they won't use a name. Sometimes they'll just claim to be an eyewitness. And so we have a number of these, and most of these appear to have been forged in the 19th century. And they're the kind of things that people still quote today to me. They'll say, well, yeah, but I read that Jesus actually went to India and there he learned from the Brahmins. And, and they talk about the missing years of Jesus between, the ages of 12 and 30. Where was he? Oh, he went to Egypt, and he learned the magic from the Egyptians, Egyptian, and you have these things, or you have an eyewitness account of Jesus being crucified. And that he's this person is writing that he saw it happen, and so you have these things. They go by, they're different ones by different titles. They've all been demonstrated to be 19th century forgeries. The people who wrote them often made a lot of money on them because they sold them as authentic accounts, an eyewitness account, or this is what, and they'll have discovery stories that will help people make people believe they're authentic. And so somebody will be on a trip to some monastery in Tibet, and the monks there have this ancient book written in some ancient script, and he'll look at it and he realized that it's an account of somebody who's traveling through back in the first century, and he happened to stay there and broke his leg and had to stay there or something in the monastery, and he writes his book about this man Jesus, and so he's an eyewitness to Jesus' life, and his book just happened to be in this monastery in Tibet. It's like you come up with something, you think, wow, that sounds convincing, and so he writes the book. And so that's the kind of thing that happened, that you get these forgeries. So I don't know what I do, 4 or 5 of them at the end of the book. Yeah. So it's kind of like today when I started teaching at Rutgers in the mid 1980s, the Hitler diaries came out. It was a multi-volume work of Hitler's diaries throughout the entire Second World War until the day he died. And people believed them. And they sold for millions of dollars, and they were proved to be forgeries. So same thing with Jesus.
And in my closing question, before I take a couple of more super chats and close, can you tell us about the Book of Thomas the Contender and when it was composed?
So Thomas the Contender is one of the books that is found in the so-called Gnostic Gospels, discovered near the village of Nag Hammadi in 1945. So it's one of the Nag Hammadi texts. It claims to be written by this figure Thomas, who is known from the Gospel of Thomas and the Acts of Thomas to have been thought to have been Jesus' twin brother. It's a Gnostic text that is embodying a Gnostic worldview, written by Gnostic for Gnostics with Gnostic points of view. It's often, though, understood to be included in the group of writings that are called Thomasine Gnostic writings. Some scholars are nervous about calling these writings Gnostic because they're very different from other kinds of Gnostic writings that are labeled Sethian Gnostics, connected with Seth, or Valentinian Gnostic texts. Most of the Nag Hammadi library are Valentinian or Sethian texts. This is a Thomasine text. The Thomasine texts tend to emphasize that people have come from a different world, that they need to escape this world by acquiring secret knowledge, and often they stress the use of asceticism in order to attain salvation by escaping their material bodies. And you get those kinds of teachings in Thomas the Contender.
Normative, thank you for your super chat. The criteria historians employ to sift historical material from the Gospels are intuitively plausible, but do they have independent empirical support?
One big problem with New Testament scholars is that they treat historical criteria as if they've been made up for the Gospels. Like people invented these for the Gospels, and then they can show, well, they're kind of problematic for the Gospels. And so okay, we can't have them anymore. What they overlook is that these various criteria that scholars have kind of reified, they kind of define them narrowly. You got the criterion of independent attestation. You got the criterion of dissimilarity. You got the criterion of coherence. You got these criteria, and people think they're just making stuff up here because they're just coming up with stuff here. Like, who else uses that kind of thing? I never read a biography of Abraham Lincoln that talks about the criterion of independence, or the criterion of dissimilarity, or the criterion of embarrassment. What are you people talking about? And so that's right. New Testament scholars have done that. But even the scholars who use these things fail to realize why they're important and why, in fact, they're just the criteria every historian uses. They just don't call them this. And so if you are trying to find out about Abraham Lincoln, how do you go about doing it? You suppose you want to write a biography. Well, you look for your you look for the sources from, his life period. And if you want to talk about the war, you talk about, sources that come from the 1860s. You look for, you'd like to have eyewitness sources. Suppose you don't have any eyewitnesses. Well, okay, you've got other sources. So you see how many of them you got. And you want to know, did any of them borrow from someone else? Because if you got two sources saying the same thing, like you got two paragraphs of Abraham Lincoln say, well, okay, yeah, he's got it from him. Okay, so those are not independent. So you want as many independent sources as you can get. And if you got a bunch of independent sources that say the same thing, say, okay, well, that probably happened. Or you have sources that say things that are like contrary to the thesis of this biography, to the source itself. Like you have a real fan of Abraham Lincoln that admits that he did something really stupid one time, or he did something like really wrong, and it says, and so he's trying to celebrate Lincoln, but he's got this story in there. Well, so if you've got a story that is doing the opposite of what the author of the story wants to say, is it likely that he made it up? No, probably not. Why is he saying it? Well, because everybody knew the story happened. He's got to say it because everybody knew it happened. And so he said it, even though it's at cross purposes of what he had to say. So you look at that. You look at things like, does it talk about, Abraham Lincoln, like one day had a problem with his microwave oven? Well, if it says that, you got a pretty good idea this source is not authentic because it's an acronym. This is just what historians do. New Testament scholars have fixated on these things so much so that now everybody's saying, oh, the criteria don't work anymore. Then you ask them, well, okay, how are you going to establish history? Oh, I don't know. They have no idea. It's because they don't read enough history. Just read how biographers and historians work and you have a better idea how to deal with Jesus. And it's basically, just don't call them that. Call them something else, but do what historians do.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Why do some Jews still believe in Lilith today? Is the account of her being Adam's first wife in ancient Israel really taught as being real?
Well, I mean, of course, most Jews don't believe a thing about it, and so there are, of course, there are probably Jews who think I'm sure there are things I don't know what many conservative Jews think, or Jews who are mainly influenced by later legend. But there are many Christians who believe all sorts of things about Jesus or things about the Bible. I know Christians who believe in Lilith, actually. And so, I mean, so yes, is it actually, is it taught in ancient Israel? I've never heard any actual, Jewish teacher teach it, but I don't know. I mean, it may be that in some Jewish circles it is. Other people know more about that, but the fact that people could teach it as true is no more ridiculous than people teaching anything else. It's, that it's ridiculous is true. It's like what people say about Jesus sometimes.
Hi, Fish and Atai, thank you for your super chat. Referring to my comment about Ariston, there is an ossuary with the name Ariston and Yehuda the proselyte. If this can be matched to Ariston the priest, could this give credence to earlier claim?
Well, how are you going to match it to the priest? And how are you going to date it? So I'm just saying, look up the scholarship on Ariston, and you'll see. And I mean, ossuaries are very tricky. It's very difficult to date inscriptions. Inscriptions are usually just scratched onto a bone box, an ossuary, and sometimes on investigation you can show that an inscription is a modern forgery. Sometimes people cover their tracks well, but an ossuary, if an ossuary was inscribed in the 5th century versus the 1st century, how are you going to know that? And so I would just say, look at the scholarship and see what you think. But the key is, don't just look up internet sources by people who aren't experts. Look up people who actually are experts in ancient Judaism, for example, experts on ossuaries, experts who are real archaeologists, and see what they have to say.
C. Kenneth Bauer, thank you for your super chat. Revelation 21, 1-9, the same place as Revelation 21, 10 to Revelation 22, 5.
I have to look it up because I haven't memorized the book of Revelation, even though I just recently wrote a book on it. So I need to see what this person is talking about. 21:10 says that the Spirit carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And is it the same? Oh, is that the same as talked about in chapter 21, 1-9? Then I saw the new heaven, the new earth, verse. Oh, I see what they're asking. It's saying, oh, okay, yeah, it's making a good point. In 21, verses 1-9, John, the person allegedly having these visions, sees that God has created a new heaven and a new earth, and that he sees the holy Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And then in chapter 21, verses 9-22:7, he describes this new Jerusalem, and he says that he's taken up to a high mountain and shown it. I think what happens is he sees the new Jerusalem descending from heaven in the first 9 verses, but then he's actually taken to it to investigate it. And this is that second half of the chapter then is where you get the description of it, including, the gates of pearl, and the streets of gold and that kind of thing. That comes from the description. But I think, yeah, it's the same New Jerusalem. There aren't two. I think there's one New Jerusalem being described.
So we'll close with this super chat question. Bible Theory, thank you for your super chat. What are your thoughts on Paul's letters, Paul and Acts, quoting Plato, other philosophers, Bacchae? Why use previous writings as their own?
Paul never quotes Plato in his writings, and he doesn't quote the Bacchae. The Bacchae is a play by Euripides. The only place that Paul actually quotes a philosopher, to my knowledge, is in the book of Acts, in his speech on the Areopagus, in Acts chapter 17. And let me just quickly make sure I get the quotation right, because I don't want to misquote it. So this is when Paul is speaking, and he says he's trying to show that the author is he's trying to show the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers on the Areopagus, Mars Hill, that God does not dwell in any physical facade, that God, in fact, is everywhere. He's not served by, that he doesn't live in shrines, but that he's in us. And then he says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your poets say. That's a quoting from a book by an author named Aratus, Aratus. It's not by Plato. Some people have thought that you can detect some Platonic themes in Paul. More people suspect you can find some Stoic themes in Paul, especially in his moral philosophy and his ethics. I don't think that Paul read Plato. I don't think he read Stoic philosophers. I think that there were lines floating around in the common world, common sayings, and Paul may have heard about these philosophers and heard some kind of summaries of what they taught, but I don't think there's any evidence that he actually read these things, let alone mastered them. I think that was very rare for people to do. And among Jewish authors at the time, apart from Philo, yeah, not much, not much at all.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Bart.
Okay, thank you for having me. We had a lot of really good questions, and I think we covered my book pretty well. So if people want to know more about it, read the book. And if you want more about it, read the big book. And the other thing I'd like to say is that some of these topics I deal with on my own podcast, the Misquoting Jesus podcast, that people should check out, but also my blog. I blog 5 times a week, have done for over 12 and a half years now. And you have access to the archives, and I talk about this kind of stuff all the time on my blog, and people can ask questions, and I actually answer them. So you check out those things as alternatives.
And also check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below to go get his book, Forged. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.